Imagine a world where the night keeps growing longer, where each sunset steals a little more warmth than the one before it, and where no one knows if the sun will ever return. There are no clocks, no calendars, no written promises that tomorrow will be brighter. Only memory, instinct, and fear. This is where our story truly begins, not with celebration, not with joy, but with uncertainty so deep it presses against the human chest like cold stone. Tens of thousands of years ago, winter was not poetic. It was not cozy. It was not decorative. Winter was hunger. Winter was silence. Winter was the sound of wind moving through dead grass and the knowledge that something essential was disappearing from the sky. As the days shortened, early humans noticed the change not intellectually, but physically. The cold arrived earlier each evening. The darkness lingered longer each morning. Shadows stretched across familiar landscapes, transforming them into places of danger. And above all of this loomed a single, terrifying question that had no answer. What if the sun was dying? To us, this question feels almost childish, easily dismissed with scientific certainty. But for people who lived entirely at the mercy of nature, the sun was not an object in space. It was warmth on the skin, light in the eyes, life itself. Crops depended on it. Animals followed it. Human survival was stitched directly to its presence. When the sun weakened, everything weakened with it. And as winter deepened, it truly appeared as though the world was slipping toward a permanent night. The fear did not arrive suddenly. It crept in slowly, just as the darkness did. At first, the shortening days were barely noticeable. Then they became undeniable. The sun no longer climbed as high in the sky. Its path grew shallow, fragile, as if exhausted. Each dawn felt delayed. Each dusk arrived too soon. Fires had to burn longer. Food stores dwindled faster. Children cried more often in the cold. Elders watched the horizon with eyes full of memories, trying to remember if it had always been this bad. And still, the sun continued to retreat. There is something deeply unsettling about a threat that moves slowly. A predator can be fought or fled from. A storm arrives and leaves. But the gradual disappearance of light is different. It gives you time to think. Time to worry. Time to imagine the worst. For early humans, this slow descent into darkness was not just environmental, it was psychological. It planted a seed of dread that grew with every passing day. At night, the sky stretched endlessly above them, vast and indifferent. Stars burned cold and distant. The moon offered only a pale imitation of daylight, enough to reveal shapes but not safety. In the darkness beyond the firelight, predators moved unseen. The cold gnawed at exposed skin. Sleep came in fragments. Dreams, when they arrived, were often filled with falling, freezing, or being swallowed by shadow. And yet, morning always came. At least, it used to. As the year approached its deepest winter point, mornings felt uncertain. Dawn was no longer guaranteed in the way it had once been. The idea that light might simply stop returning began to feel plausible. After all, why wouldn't it? Animals died. Plants withered. People themselves grew old and disappeared. Why should the sun be any different? This is the emotional landscape in which the winter solstice was born, not as a date, but as a feeling. The feeling that the world was holding its breath. On the longest night of the year, the darkness reached its peak. The sun sank to its lowest point in the sky, barely lifting itself above the horizon before collapsing again. The day was so short it felt like a mistake. For ancient people, this was not just another night. This was the moment everything seemed most fragile. If the sun were to vanish forever, this would be the night it happened. Families huddled together. Fires were guarded obsessively, fed with precious fuel. Stories were told not for entertainment, but for reassurance. Voices filled the darkness to push back the silence. In these moments, humanity confronted one of its earliest shared fears, the fear that the light might not return, and that existence itself could quietly fade away. What is striking is not just the fear, but the response to it. Instead of surrendering to despair, early humans watched. They observed. They remembered. Somewhere deep in collective memory was the faint recollection that this had happened before. That the darkness had grown long once, and then, somehow, it had loosened its grip. That the sun, wounded and weak though it seemed, had found the strength to climb again. But memory is fragile, especially when hunger sharpens doubt. So they waited. Waiting, in this context, was not passive. It was an act of courage. Each day after the longest night was watched carefully. Did the sun linger even a heartbeat longer in the sky? Did the dawn arrive a breath earlier? The changes were almost imperceptible, so subtle they could easily be imagined. And yet, those tiny shifts meant everything. They were the difference between annihilation and survival. When the realization finally came, that the sun had stopped retreating, that its decline had reached an end, it must have felt miraculous. Not explosive or triumphant, but quiet and overwhelming. The darkness had not won. The world was not ending. Light, though still weak, had survived. This moment, more than any other, carved itself into the human soul. Because what was learned here went far beyond astronomy. It was a lesson about endurance. About cycles. About the strange truth that life often reaches its lowest point just before it begins to rise again. The winter solstice was not celebrated because it was joyful, but because it proved something essential, that darkness has limits. Long before gods were named, long before temples rose from the ground, long before stories were written down, this understanding took root. The sun's return became a promise whispered across generations. A reassurance passed from parent to child, from elder to tribe. Even when everything seemed lost, something unseen was already turning beneath the surface. And that promise would echo forward through time, changing shape but never meaning. Because the fear that gave birth to the solstice never truly left us. We may no longer worry that the sun will vanish from the sky, but we still know what it feels like to move through long internal winters. We still recognize the sensation of light fading from our lives, of warmth withdrawing, of hope feeling distant and unsure. The ancient terror of endless night has simply shifted inward. This is why the winter solstice matters. Not because of what it marks in the sky, but because of what it reveals in us. It is the first moment humanity learned that wading through darkness could lead to renewal. That survival was not always about fighting harder, but about enduring longer. That rebirth does not arrive with thunder, but quietly, almost invisibly, one lengthening day at a time. The night the sun almost died was also the night humanity discovered hope. And everything that would later become Christmas, every candle, every story of light born in darkness, every promise of renewal, can trace its emotional origin back to this moment, when frightened humans stared into the longest night and chose to believe that the light would return, even before they had proof. Long before calendars existed, before numerals carved meaning into stone or clay, early humans experienced time in a profoundly different way than we do today. Time was not measured in hours, days, or months. It was measured in hunger, in the rising and falling of temperatures, in the migration of animals, and in the slow decay or growth of plants. Time was lived as a series of sensations, as the body's response to the environment, and as a collective memory of survival. It was, in essence, a rhythm rather than a measurement, a pulse rather than a line on a chart. And it is within this rhythm that the earliest understanding of the solstice emerged, not as a date, but as a moment charged with meaning, a point where the world seemed to pause and humanity felt itself suspended in the balance between despair and hope. Without clocks or calendars, humans had to rely on their senses to track the passage of seasons. The sun's position in the sky, the angle of shadows cast by rocks and trees, the way certain plants bent toward the light, or how the tracks of prey appeared and disappeared across frozen ground, all became vital indicators of temporal change. In this world, a misjudgment about the season could mean the difference between life and death. Hunters and gatherers needed to anticipate the availability of food, the approach of cold, and the behavior of animals whose survival strategies were tuned to seasonal rhythms. Every day carried with it a subtle awareness of time passing, a bodily and mental attunement to cycles that we now quantify with numbers but which they experienced through a far more intimate, almost sacred connection to the world around them. The shortening of days during the approach of winter was not an abstract phenomenon. It was tangible, physical, and inescapable. Sunlight retreated earlier each evening, leaving humans in increasing darkness. Morning light, which once arrived predictably, seemed to hesitate before piercing the horizon. Shadows lengthened across familiar landscapes, making the world feel alien and dangerous. Each day, survival became incrementally more challenging. Food sources were scarcer, and the cold penetrated more deeply, testing both endurance and resolve. In these conditions, humans were not merely observing the passage of time, they were living it, bodily, in a way that merged their consciousness with the environment. Every moment was a negotiation with mortality, and every shift in the sun's movement carried profound emotional weight. It was in these circumstances that early humans began to notice patterns, a recognition that was subtle yet transformative. The cycles of the sun, moon, and stars were not arbitrary, they repeated, slowly, with a precision that humans could learn to anticipate. Perhaps it began with the simple observation that after the longest night, dawn seemed to linger just a fraction longer, and the sun's descent became less severe. Perhaps it was seeing that certain animals, long absent, returned to the area when the light began to increase again. These observations, repeated over years and generations, allowed humans to begin mapping time, not in days and months, but in rhythms and markers. They began to sense the turning points of the year, moments when nature itself seemed to shift direction, and among these, none carried more weight than the winter solstice. The solstice represented a pause in the relentless march of darkness. For early humans, it was the point at which the sun reached its lowest, most fragile point, and from which it would begin its gradual return. In a world where survival was inseparable from environmental conditions, recognizing this point was critical. It was not merely a celestial curiosity, it was knowledge that could inform action. It told them when to expect the first signs of returning warmth, when to anticipate animal migrations, when certain plants might reappear. It was a guide, a subtle but profound tool, for navigating the perilous winter months. But more than this, it was a psychological anchor. In the midst of extreme cold and darkness, the recognition that the sun would eventually return offered a quiet reassurance, a fragile hope that life could continue despite the hardship pressing in from every side. Yet this recognition was not immediate, and it did not come without fear. Early humans experienced the deepening darkness not only as an environmental challenge but as an existential one. The slow lengthening of nights forced reflection, even if unconscious, on fragility and mortality. Every long night was a test of endurance, and every faint return of light was a reminder of nature's mercy. Over time, these experiences became encoded in collective memory. Stories and rituals emerged to mark these moments, not as abstract celebrations, but as practical and emotional tools for surviving the season. They were early expressions of what we might call cultural intelligence, a way of using memory, observation, and ritual to anchor humanity in time itself. The emotional dimension of time was particularly pronounced. In a landscape dominated by unpredictability, the recognition of a reliable turning point offered not only guidance but a kind of spiritual reassurance. The solstice was a proof that the world followed a rhythm, that there was a pattern behind the apparent chaos, and that even in the coldest, darkest periods, change was coming. In this sense, time became more than a sequence of events. It became a narrative, a story that could be read in shadows, in the movement of animals, in the shifting angles of sunlight. Each year, the solstice reminded humans that endings are never permanent, and beginnings are always possible. It taught them patience, attentiveness, and the subtle power of observation. Anthropologically, This emerging awareness of temporal cycles laid the groundwork for more complex social and cultural structures. Tribes and bands began coordinating activities around the seasons, not only for practical survival but also for collective ritual. Certain days were marked for hunting expeditions, for gathering specific plants, or for communal fires where stories were told and knowledge shared. Time, previously experienced as a personal, bodily phenomenon, began to be externalized and shared. It became communal. And in this communal sense, the solstice held a central place. It was a collective checkpoint, a moment when society itself paused to acknowledge the rhythms of nature, to endure together, and to prepare for the slow return of light. The solstice also became a mirror of human consciousness. Just as the days were at their shortest, human introspection deepened. Without external distractions such as artificial light, humans were forced to confront both the literal darkness outside and the metaphorical darkness within. It is likely that the first myths, the earliest sacred narratives, emerged from these moments of extended night. Humans projected meaning onto the cycles they observed, attributing intention or spirit to the sun, the moon, and the stars. The recognition of the solstice as a turning point in time was inseparable from the recognition of vulnerability, mortality, and the need for hope. Ultimately, life before calendars was not primitive in the sense of lacking sophistication. It was sophisticated in a way that is almost unimaginable to modern humans. Time was felt, lived, and remembered, and the winter solstice became the ultimate expression of temporal intelligence. It was a way of turning the abstract into the tangible, the invisible into the visible, and fear into understanding. Early humans discovered, through careful observation and shared memory, that life itself follows cycles, and that the darkest point is also the point before renewal. The winter solstice, then, was not merely a marker of days, it was a revelation, a first glimpse into the delicate balance of time, survival, and human consciousness. It taught early humans that to endure is not just to survive physically, but to synchronize the self with the greater rhythms of the world, to find meaning in the invisible patterns that govern life, and to recognize that every long night eventually gives way to dawn. Long before the construction of temples, the invention of writing, or the establishment of organized societies, humans looked up at the sky and felt something that transcended survival. The stars, the sun, the moon, and the vast expanse of night were more than background scenery, they were active participants in life, silent witnesses to the rhythms of existence. To early humans, the sky was both a guide and a mystery, a map for hunting and migration, a clock for planting and harvesting, and a canvas on which the imagination could roam freely. It was in this vast, awe-inspiring expanse that the first observers of the heavens began to notice patterns, subtle repetitions that promised insight, survival, and, eventually, meaning. Observing the sky was not a casual pastime. It was a matter of life and death. The movements of the sun dictated when warmth would return and when the cold would deepen. The position of the moon affected tides, influencing rivers, lakes, and the availability of fish. The patterns of stars guided nocturnal hunters, allowing them to track prey across miles of darkened terrain. Early humans quickly realized that celestial bodies moved in ways that were remarkably consistent, yet their motions were slow and demanding to interpret. Patience was essential, as understanding the cycles of the heavens required generations of observation. One day, one season, even one human lifetime might not reveal the full truth. It was a collective, intergenerational endeavor, where the sky itself became a teacher, and humans the tireless students. The first watchers of the sky did not see a mechanistic universe. They saw personalities, forces, and stories writ large across the heavens. The sun was alive, powerful, and mercurial. The moon was cyclical, mysterious, and capable of influence over both earth and mind. The stars formed constellations that seemed to move with intention, aligning with landmarks and seasonal markers. These celestial actors were interwoven with the daily and seasonal lives of humans. When a certain star rose at a particular time, it signaled the approach of winter, or the return of migratory herds. Over time, humans learned to correlate celestial movements with earthly events, creating a mental framework that transformed chaos into order. What is remarkable is that this was not mere observation. Humans were engaging in an early form of what we would now call science, though it was inseparable from myth and emotion. Observing the sky required acute attention to detail, the ability to remember minute changes over years, and the wisdom to interpret patterns in ways that were both practical and meaningful. It was a mental exercise that expanded cognitive abilities, encouraged collaboration, and nurtured a profound respect for forces greater than the self. It is likely that these early skywatchers, hunters, shamans, or simply the most attentive members of a tribe, were among the first to blend empirical observation with narrative, creating stories that explained why the sun and stars behaved as they did, and by extension, why humans themselves existed in such a precarious world. The process of observing and interpreting the sky was deeply tied to emotion. The slow retreat of the sun during winter, the apparent stillness of the stars, the phases of the moon, all of these phenomena were intimately connected to the human experience of fear, hope, and wonder. Nights grew longer and colder, and early humans understood that survival depended on anticipating what was coming. At the same time, the sky offered reassurance. The sun, though diminished, had not disappeared entirely. The stars, fixed and reliable, traced paths across the heavens that promised continuity. In this way, the cosmos became both a threat and a guide, a source of anxiety and comfort. Learning to read it was a necessary skill, one that intertwined practical knowledge with a nascent sense of spirituality. Over generations, these observations became encoded in memory, in songs, and in early symbolic practices. Humans began to mark the movement of celestial bodies using the environment itself. Stones, trees, hills, and rivers became reference points. Certain locations were repeatedly visited at precise times of year, serving as primitive observatories. The alignment of stones, the spacing of posts, or even the positioning of fire pits could reflect deep awareness of solar, lunar, and stellar cycles. Through these repeated actions, the cosmos became an extension of human consciousness. Each sunrise and sunset, each full moon and rising constellation, was an opportunity to reaffirm one's place in a vast, ordered universe. What is extraordinary about this early astronomy is how it was integrated into daily life and survival strategies. Understanding when the sun would reach its lowest point in winter was not an abstract pursuit, it was critical to planning food storage, shelter reinforcement, and communal rituals. Recognizing the predictable return of the sun allowed humans to endure the longest nights with hope rather than despair. Observing the moon's phases helped track tides and seasonal changes that affected fishing, travel, and the availability of water. The stars offered guidance across dark landscapes, reducing the unpredictability of movement at night. In every case, celestial observation became a tool for navigating uncertainty, a way to exert agency in a world where the environment often seemed indifferent or hostile. Beyond survival, watching the sky cultivated a sense of wonder and curiosity that would shape human culture for millennia. The night sky became a mirror reflecting human fears, aspirations, and imagination. People projected stories onto the stars, assigning meaning to their arrangement and movement. Early myths were often celestial in origin, connecting the lives of humans with the cycles of the sun, moon, and stars. Gods and spirits were mapped onto constellations, celestial events were interpreted as omens or messages. In this way, astronomy was inseparable from storytelling, ritual, and morality. The heavens were not only a practical guide but a canvas for understanding existence itself. By observing the cosmos, early humans began to explore questions that have endured through every civilization: where do we come from? What governs our fate? Can we predict the unknowable? Perhaps most importantly, observing the sky instilled patience and perspective. Humans learned that change is often slow, that the consequences of action are tied to cycles beyond immediate perception. The rising and setting of the sun, the waxing and waning of the moon, the gradual drift of the stars, all taught that life unfolds according to patterns that can be discerned but not controlled. This awareness shaped not only survival strategies but also cognitive and emotional development. It taught humans to endure long winters, to anticipate long-term consequences, and to find meaning in repetition and rhythm. The sky became both a teacher and a guardian, offering lessons that extended far beyond mere survival. In essence, the earliest skywatchers were the first philosophers as much as they were observers. By linking celestial patterns with earthly events, they were beginning to perceive the universe as a coherent system, one in which humanity had a fragile but recognizable place. They were mapping not only the movement of stars and planets but the trajectory of human life itself, from fear and uncertainty to hope and renewal. Their discoveries laid the groundwork for every subsequent attempt to understand time, space, and our own existence. Without their attention, without their patience, the fundamental connection between humanity and the cycles of the cosmos might never have been recognized, and the profound symbolism of events like the winter solstice, the moment when the sun seems to pause, poised on the brink of return, might have been lost to time. These first observers of the sky were more than early astronomers, they were architects of human perception. By looking upward, they transformed the unknown into a navigable, interpretable world. They discovered that patterns exist, that time can be read, and that the universe, though vast and indifferent, is consistent enough to provide hope. And in doing so, they planted the seeds of a tradition that would carry forward into every civilization, the need to understand the heavens, to mark the turning of seasons, and to recognize that even in the deepest darkness, patterns emerge that point the way to light. Their eyes lifted toward the sky not only to survive but to comprehend, to find meaning in motion, order in chaos, and reassurance in repetition. Through their vigilance, humanity took its first steps toward seeing itself as part of a larger story, a story written across the stars, the sun, and the fragile light that returns after every longest night. Long before written history, long before temples or cities, humans began leaving traces of their understanding of the cosmos in stone. Across the ancient world, from the high plains of Anatolia to the rolling hills of Britain, structures were aligned with the movements of the sun, moon, and stars. These monumental constructions were not mere displays of craftsmanship or power, they were the earliest expressions of a profound awareness, that the cycles of the heavens governed the rhythms of life, that survival depended on observing patterns, and that marking these celestial events offered not just practical guidance, but also a sense of security in a dangerous, unpredictable world. Among these cycles, none was more significant than the winter solstice, the moment when the sun reached its lowest point and the longest night stretched across the land. The structures humans built to track this phenomenon were at once practical, symbolic, and profoundly spiritual, transforming stone and earth into calendars, observatories, and sacred spaces. Göbekli Tepe in modern-day Turkey, for example, represents one of the earliest known examples of monumental human construction, dating back over 11,000 years. Massive stone pillars, carefully arranged in circular enclosures, bear carvings of animals, symbols, and abstract shapes. While the precise purposes of these structures remain debated, many archaeologists suggest that some alignments correspond to the movements of celestial bodies, including the solstice sun. Imagine standing in the center of one of these stone circles on the winter solstice, witnessing the faintest light strike a specific pillar. For early humans, this alignment would have been more than observation, it would have been proof that the universe could be understood, that the darkness would end, and that life could endure. Stone, in this sense, became a medium for knowledge, memory, and reassurance, a tangible interface between humans and the cosmos. Further west, Stonehenge in England provides perhaps the most iconic example of this relationship between architecture and the sky. The massive sarsen stones, arranged with mathematical precision, frame the solstice sunrise and sunset with astonishing accuracy. On the longest day of winter, the sun rises in perfect alignment with the heel stone, casting light into the heart of the stone circle. For the people who built it, these alignments were not decorative or arbitrary. They were deeply functional, marking a critical turning point in the year. They were statements of understanding and mastery over an otherwise uncontrollable environment. The stones themselves became symbols of the sun's endurance, standing tall as the days began to lengthen once more, a reminder that light could never be permanently extinguished. What is remarkable about these constructions is the immense labor and coordination required. Erecting massive stones without modern tools demanded sophisticated knowledge of engineering, careful planning, and collective effort. Every placement was deliberate, every angle calculated, often over decades. This investment of human energy underscores the significance these moments held. The solstice was not a fleeting curiosity, it was central to survival and understanding. Communities committed enormous resources to mark and honor it, demonstrating that the alignment of human life with cosmic cycles was more than practical, it was existential. The stones became embodiments of hope, endurance, and collective memory, anchoring human experience to the rhythms of the universe. Beyond the practical and symbolic, these structures also shaped ritual and social cohesion. Stone circles, megalithic temples, and other monumental alignments were gathering places, where early humans could collectively witness the sun's return and participate in ceremonies designed to reaffirm their place in the cosmos. These rituals likely combined observation with storytelling, music, and offerings, blending empirical knowledge with spiritual experience. In the harshest months, when survival was most precarious, the act of coming together to mark the solstice provided psychological and social sustenance. The stones, aligned with the sun, were more than objects, they were anchors for community, markers of shared understanding, and vessels of reassurance that the darkness would eventually give way. In addition to the alignment with the sun, many of these sites exhibit artistic expressions that reflect an intimate engagement with the natural world and its cycles. Carvings of animals, abstract symbols, and other motifs often appear on stones and walls, suggesting that early humans were not only documenting celestial events but also embedding meaning and memory within the environment. These images may have served as reminders of survival, fertility, death, and rebirth, intertwining the cycles of the natural world with human consciousness. By incorporating these symbols into spaces aligned with the sun, humans created multi-layered sites where observation, ritual, and reflection converged, transforming stone into a repository of both knowledge and emotion. The architectural choices made in these megalithic sites also speak to an emerging understanding of permanence and continuity. Stone endures far longer than wood or organic materials, and by engraving meaning into stone and aligning it with cosmic cycles, humans were ensuring that knowledge of the solstice and its significance could persist across generations. These constructions became mnemonic devices, guiding those who came after to read the rhythms of the world without needing written records. In this way, the stones themselves became teachers, transmitting wisdom about time, survival, and the cycles of light and dark. They served as both scientific instruments and spiritual symbols, bridging the gap between the observable universe and human understanding. Moreover, these constructions illustrate the deep emotional resonance of the solstice. The act of building, aligning, and observing required anticipation, patience, and a belief in something beyond immediate survival. These early architects understood that the longest night was not merely a physical challenge, but an emotional and psychological one. By aligning their monumental works with the sun's path, they were asserting control over fear, creating tangible proof that darkness was finite and light would return. The stones stood as silent witnesses to human resilience, testaments that even in the harshest moments, there was a rhythm to life that could be trusted. In essence, they transformed the solstice from a moment of anxiety into a source of hope, from an event to be feared into a marker of endurance and continuity. The cumulative effect of these megalithic alignments was profound. By situating human experience within the grand patterns of the cosmos, early societies developed a sense of connection to something larger than themselves. Observing the sun rise along a precisely placed stone, or noticing the subtle shift of shadows across a circle, provided reassurance that life had order and predictability. These structures were early manifestations of humanity's desire to understand, to endure, and to find meaning in the cycles of existence. They were, in many ways, humanity's first attempts to anchor intangible concepts, time, hope, survival, into the physical world, ensuring that the lessons of the solstice would echo long after the builders themselves had passed. Through these monumental works, stone became a language. Its arrangement spoke of fear and courage, despair and hope, darkness and light. It transformed abstract celestial movements into tangible, comprehensible events. It allowed humans to synchronize their lives with the universe, to anticipate change, and to mark the resilience of life itself. From Göbekli Tepe to Stonehenge and countless other sites whose purposes are only partially understood, one message resounds clearly: the solstice was not merely an astronomical occurrence, it was a profound human revelation, a moment that demanded recognition, reverence, and remembrance. Through stone, shadow, and sacred alignment, early humans carved both knowledge and meaning into the earth, creating a bridge between the fleeting human experience and the enduring patterns of the cosmos. As the sun sank to its lowest point in the sky and the longest night of the year stretched across the land, early humans experienced a tension that was both physical and psychological. The winter solstice was more than a celestial event, it was an existential moment, a peak of uncertainty when survival itself seemed precarious. In these ancient landscapes, where food was scarce, predators roamed freely, and temperatures could drop to lethal extremes, the darkness was not merely an absence of light. It pressed down on the body, the mind, and the community. Every shadow became a potential threat. Every sound, a warning. And in the hearts of those who witnessed this moment, there was a profound awareness that this might be the night that everything failed. The fear that gripped early humans during the longest night was not abstract. It was a visceral sensation, encoded in the body through hunger, cold, and the knowledge of vulnerability. When nightfall came, it was absolute, and it lasted longer than at any other time of the year. Fires, precious and finite, had to be tended continuously, their glow stretching thin across the darkness. The act of maintaining light became a ritual in itself, a struggle against the encroaching cold. Every spark preserved was a small victory over despair, every flicker a symbol that life could persist through the trial of the night. These moments were shared collectively, the survival of one depended on the vigilance of all, creating a profound sense of interdependence. Fear, in this sense, was not only a solitary experience, it was social, binding humans together through shared anxiety and mutual care. The environmental pressures of the solstice were relentless. Food stores, often limited and already diminished after months of cold, demanded careful rationing. Hunting, which had become increasingly difficult as prey migrated or hibernated, offered little promise of replenishment. Even water, sometimes frozen over or hidden beneath layers of ice, required effort and ingenuity to access. These practical challenges compounded the psychological weight of the season. Humans were acutely aware that their existence was precarious, that any mistake could have catastrophic consequences. And yet, in the midst of these hardships, they learned to endure, to adapt, and to observe patterns that hinted at relief. The lengthening night forced patience, and patience itself became a form of survival. But it was not merely survival that was at stake. The solstice also forced early humans to confront mortality on a profound level. In the absence of distraction, without the warmth of abundant food or the safety of daylight, the mind turned inward. Thoughts of death, loss, and the fragility of life became unavoidable. Communities had to comfort each other, tell stories, and create meaning to offset the weight of uncertainty. Storytelling was not entertainment, it was a tool, a way of encoding experience, transmitting knowledge, and preserving hope. Tales of the sun's return, of predators avoided, of successful hunts, or of the endurance of the community became lifelines. Each narrative, passed from one generation to the next, strengthened both practical knowledge and emotional resilience, embedding in the human psyche the understanding that the darkness, no matter how long, would not last forever. The longest night was also a crucible for social cohesion. In many ways, it acted as an early test of community dynamics. Those who could maintain composure, share resources, and support others became essential members of the tribe. Those who succumbed to fear or despair risked not only their own lives but the survival of the group. In this way, the solstice may have played a role in shaping social structures, fostering collaboration, and strengthening the bonds of interdependence. The necessity of enduring together forged patterns of behavior that were as important for cultural evolution as they were for immediate survival. Collective endurance became a marker of identity and a form of silent ritual, a recognition that the longest night was a shared trial, a threshold that all must pass. Emotionally, the solstice night carried contrasts that were nearly unbearable. Fear coexisted with awe. Anxiety mingled with wonder. The stars, distant and indifferent, shone with brilliance against the black sky, offering a fragile consolation. The cold, while brutal, clarified the senses and sharpened awareness. Every sound and movement became heightened, revealing the delicate balance of life in a harsh environment. Humans, acutely attuned to the rhythms of nature, experienced a profound intimacy with the world during these nights. There was a recognition that life itself was miraculous, that survival was not guaranteed, and that every breath was a small triumph. In this way, the longest night was a teacher, instructing humans in vigilance, patience, and the quiet endurance necessary to persist in a precarious world. Over time, the repeated experience of the solstice began to shape ritual and practice. Fires were tended not only for warmth but as symbolic guardians of light. Communities gathered together, offering stories, songs, and perhaps even sacrifices, to reinforce the sense that light would return. These rituals, though primitive by modern standards, encoded essential lessons, that observation, memory, and collective action could mitigate fear, that even in darkness, human ingenuity and cooperation were powerful, and that cycles of nature were reliable, if only one paid attention. Through repeated engagement with the solstice, humans transformed anxiety into knowledge, fear into expectation, and uncertainty into a shared experience that strengthened the group. The psychological impact of the longest night extended beyond the immediate moment. By facing the extremity of darkness and surviving, early humans internalized the knowledge that life endures through hardship. They learned to anticipate change, to read the subtle signs of the world, and to understand that endings are not final. This awareness likely informed not only practical survival strategies but also the development of symbolic thought. The solstice, in its intensity, revealed the fragile yet resilient nature of existence, and the capacity of humans to endure, adapt, and even find meaning in the face of overwhelming uncertainty. It was a rehearsal for life itself, a concentrated experience of fear, endurance, and eventual relief that shaped both mind and culture. The solstice night, with all its tension and extremity, also served as a reference point in the human experience of time and memory. Just as the environment reached its peak challenge, so too did human awareness. The darkest night became a marker, a temporal anchor against which all other events could be measured. It reinforced the understanding that cycles govern life, that the world is patterned, and that no state, however dire, is permanent. Through this recognition, early humans began to integrate observation with emotion, survival with reflection, and physical endurance with cognitive development. The solstice was not merely a night, it was an epical experience compressed into hours, a concentrated distillation of the fears, hopes, and rhythms of existence. Ultimately, the longest night was transformative. It was a confrontation with vulnerability, a meditation on mortality, and a rehearsal for hope. The darkness pressed close, demanding attention, vigilance, and cooperation. Yet, within that very darkness, humans discovered resilience, collective strength, and the first glimmers of faith in patterns beyond immediate perception. The solstice revealed that endurance was not passive, it required awareness, adaptation, and communal effort. By facing the peak of uncertainty, early humans learned lessons that would echo through generations, that darkness is finite, that cycles are reliable, and that survival is as much a matter of perception, patience, and cooperation as it is of physical sustenance. In the crucible of the longest night, humans confronted the raw essence of existence and emerged with knowledge, resilience, and a fragile but enduring hope that would shape the story of life for millennia to come. Fire was more than warmth. It was more than light. For early humans, especially during the depths of winter, it was survival made tangible, a fragile thread that connected them to life itself in the midst of overwhelming darkness. Long before the invention of written language or the concept of ritualized religion, fire held a sacred significance born from necessity. In the coldest months, when the nights were longest and the sun appeared to falter in the sky, the act of tending a flame was an act of defiance against an indifferent universe. Each ember preserved against the night was a testament to human ingenuity, endurance, and the refusal to surrender to the oppressive weight of darkness. In these moments, fire became more than a tool, it became a symbol, an extension of human will, a quiet declaration that life would endure despite the threats pressing in from every side. The winter solstice, with its longest night and most acute absence of sunlight, was a time when fire's importance was fully realized. Darkness at this time was absolute, stretching across the landscape in an unbroken expanse. The sun, weakened and low on the horizon, provided little comfort. The cold penetrated through clothing and skin, finding its way into every crevice of shelter, bone, and thought. Animals, driven by hunger, either became predators or vanished in search of survival, leaving human communities in isolation and tension. Within this context, fire was the pivot around which life turned. It illuminated familiar terrain, revealing dangers that the eye alone could not discern. It drove away predators, provided warmth for the body, and offered a psychological reprieve from the oppressive darkness. The act of building, maintaining, and protecting a fire became a ritualized skill, passed down through observation, instruction, and communal practice. Each flame was fragile, demanding vigilance, and each flame's endurance reinforced the awareness of human agency against the indifference of nature. Fire's significance extended beyond the purely practical. In the glow of the flames, humans could gather safely together, sharing warmth, food, and stories. These gatherings during the solstice may have been among the first structured communal rituals in human history. Around the fire, the night seemed less overwhelming, and survival was no longer just an individual endeavor but a collective one. Stories told in the firelight served multiple purposes, transmitting knowledge of the environment, teaching the young about threats and survival strategies, and encoding memory of past successes and failures. Through these narratives, fire became a medium for both physical sustenance and cultural transmission. Its light illuminated not just the immediate surroundings but also the human imagination, allowing early humans to project meaning onto the world around them and the cycles of the sun and moon that governed their lives. There was also a profound psychological dimension to fire during these long winter nights. The flickering glow of flames offered reassurance in the face of uncertainty. In a time when darkness dominated most hours of existence, the fire became a constant, a predictable presence against which anxiety and fear could be measured. Its warmth was immediate and tangible, a comforting reminder that human ingenuity could counteract the most elemental threats. The fire symbolized control in a world where so much was uncontrollable: the cold, the predators, the scarcity of food, the movement of the sun and seasons beyond human influence. In tending the fire, humans exercised agency, asserting their presence in a landscape that could otherwise feel hostile and indifferent. This subtle empowerment likely had significant effects on the development of consciousness, instilling confidence in survival and reinforcing the notion that action, observation, and care could influence outcomes even in the harshest conditions. In addition, fire became a medium for symbolic expression. Early humans may have begun to associate the flame with the sun itself, the returning light that would gradually lengthen the days after the solstice. As the longest night approached, maintaining fire could be interpreted as a ritual echo of the sun's eventual return, a tangible participation in the cycle of cosmic renewal. Sparks and flames mirrored the distant brilliance of celestial bodies, miniature suns brought to life by human hands. Through this lens, fire was not merely a defensive tool, it was a bridge between the human and the cosmic, between survival in the immediate moment and hope for the future. It embodied the same tension experienced during the solstice, the delicate balance between vulnerability and endurance, fear and anticipation, darkness and light. The communal aspect of fire also reinforced social cohesion. The winter solstice, with its extreme conditions, was a time when cooperation was essential. Fire provided a central gathering point where the group could assemble, share resources, and consolidate efforts for survival. The collective act of building and tending a flame strengthened bonds, created shared rituals, and fostered a sense of interdependence. It reminded individuals that survival was not solely an individual effort but a product of collaboration, vigilance, and mutual care. The fire became a locus of collective memory and experience, anchoring the group in both physical and symbolic space. Around it, knowledge was exchanged, stories were told, and a sense of order was imposed upon the chaos of night and winter. In this way, fire transformed the solstice night from a period of isolation and fear into a shared, purposeful experience that reinforced both survival and cultural cohesion. The endurance of fire also became a measure of time and attention. Unlike the predictable cycle of the sun, which could be observed but not manipulated, the flame required constant maintenance. Wood had to be gathered, arranged, and replenished. Ashes had to be managed, sparks monitored, and embers coaxed back into life if they began to fade. This continuous engagement fostered mindfulness and presence, compelling humans to inhabit the night fully rather than retreat into panic or despair. In maintaining the fire, humans were engaging in one of the earliest forms of deliberate, sustained interaction with the environment, a combination of observation, action, and consequence that reinforced survival skills, social cohesion, and cognitive development. Fire was not passive, it demanded attention, effort, and intelligence, making the act of tending it a form of both meditation and mastery. Even beyond the immediate survival context, fire influenced the evolution of human imagination and spirituality. Its presence in the solstice night created a tangible metaphor for light conquering darkness, warmth emerging from cold, life persisting in the face of mortality. These symbolic associations would later permeate cultural practices, myths, and religious narratives, shaping humanity's relationship with light, hope, and renewal. The fire became a teaching tool, illustrating both practical and existential lessons. Endurance matters, vigilance matters, and light, whether literal or metaphorical, is something that must be nurtured and protected. In the intimate circle of its glow, humans confronted fear, understood resilience, and glimpsed the possibility of rebirth, not just in the world around them but within themselves. Through the interplay of necessity, observation, and symbolism, fire evolved into one of humanity's first sacred elements. It was a lifeline during the longest nights, a psychological anchor in a threatening world, and a vehicle for communal and cognitive development. Its flames bridged the immediate and the eternal, the physical and the symbolic, the practical and the spiritual. In tending to fire during the solstice, early humans were doing more than merely surviving. They were participating in a ritual that reaffirmed life itself, encoded knowledge across generations, and established patterns of meaning that would echo through the story of humanity. Fire became a beacon, a teacher, and a companion, illuminating the path through darkness and offering the first tangible proof that the cycles of life, hope, and renewal were enduring and reliable. Before the first marks of written language, before monuments were fully understood, and long before organized religion codified beliefs, humans relied on stories to navigate existence. These stories were born from necessity, from fear, and from the acute awareness of the fragility of life. The long nights of winter, particularly around the solstice, created a psychological crucible in which early humans confronted both mortality and the unknown. In the face of darkness, when the sun seemed weakest, storytelling became a tool for survival, a means to explain, remember, and influence the world. Stories were not mere entertainment, they were a form of early knowledge, blending observation with imagination, memory with instruction, and fear with hope. In the flickering glow of firelight, humans began to shape narratives that would define both their understanding of the cosmos and their place within it. The first stories were inseparable from the environment. The long, dark nights demanded attentiveness to survival, yet they also allowed the mind to wander and reflect. Every shadow cast by firelight could suggest movement, every sound outside the shelter could indicate danger. Early humans projected meaning onto these observations, weaving them into tales that explained what was happening, why, and how to respond. Animals became characters with intent, weather became a force with mood, and celestial phenomena took on personalities or agency. The movement of the sun, moon, and stars was interpreted not merely as natural phenomena but as acts of will, shaping human fate and guiding action. Through story, humans could impose order on chaos, transforming the terror of the longest night into a structured narrative they could understand and anticipate. Mythic thinking emerged naturally from this process. Humans began to imagine the sun as a vulnerable entity, wounded by the encroaching darkness, yet capable of recovery. They envisioned it as a hero, a deity, or a powerful force that experienced struggle, echoing their own survival challenges. These narratives allowed humans to externalize fear and project hope. The recurring cycles of light and dark became central motifs in these tales, framing existence as a rhythm of death and renewal. By narrating these cycles in story form, early humans encoded both empirical observation and emotional resilience. The solstice, the turning point of darkness into light, became the climax of these early myths, a moment when tension peaked, fear confronted hope, and the promise of continuity was renewed. Stories told during the longest nights also served as educational tools. Knowledge about the environment, the behavior of animals, and the timing of natural events was embedded within narrative. A tale about a clever fox escaping a predator, or a sun deity struggling through the night to rise again, communicated survival strategies as effectively as direct instruction. Storytelling was therefore both mnemonic and practical, ensuring that critical knowledge could be retained and transmitted even in the absence of formal language or written records. Each retelling reinforced memory and sharpened attentiveness, preparing the next generation to interpret the environment accurately, anticipate danger, and survive. The solstice, with its heightened emotional and physical pressures, amplified the significance of these stories. The longest night was a time when anxiety and fear were most acute, and narratives provided structure, meaning, and reassurance. Around the fire, communities could confront the darkness together, using story to transform the night from a void into a space of shared reflection and collective purpose. These gatherings were not casual, they were deliberate and essential. Stories became rituals in themselves, shaping the rhythm of the night, maintaining vigilance, and reinforcing communal bonds. In this way, myth and survival were intertwined, and narrative became a tool to navigate both the external and internal landscapes of human experience. Storytelling also allowed humans to grapple with abstract concepts like death, change, and renewal. By projecting human experience onto celestial cycles, animals, and the natural world, early humans could explore complex ideas indirectly. The sun, imagined as a dying or struggling entity during the winter solstice, mirrored human vulnerability, mortality, and resilience. By seeing their own challenges reflected in the cosmic narrative, humans could conceptualize endurance, hope, and rebirth on both a personal and communal scale. These narratives were not static, they evolved with observation, experience, and reflection, allowing communities to adapt their understanding to changing circumstances while maintaining continuity across generations. Furthermore, these stories created a framework for early spirituality. By attributing intention, emotion, or personality to natural forces, humans were engaging in a form of proto-religious thinking. Deities, spirits, and symbolic beings emerged naturally from the act of storytelling, bridging observation with imagination. This symbolic layer added meaning to otherwise uncontrollable events, giving humans a sense of agency or understanding over forces beyond immediate influence. The solstice, as the turning point from darkness to light, became central to these narratives, symbolizing endurance, hope, and the promise that even in the deepest trial, life could continue and triumph. Emotion played a crucial role in shaping these early stories. The solstice night, intense in its demands and fear, heightened the human experience of suspense, anticipation, and awe. Narratives reflected this intensity, often centering on conflict, struggle, and eventual resolution. By structuring experience in story form, humans could rehearse emotional responses, learn resilience, and cultivate hope. Tales of light returning after a long night reinforced the idea that survival was possible, even when the immediate circumstances seemed dire. In essence, story became a bridge between perception and understanding, guiding humans through both the practical and psychological challenges of the winter solstice. Storytelling also reinforced social hierarchy and communal roles. Those skilled in observation and narrative likely held elevated status within early human groups. Shamans, elders, or storytellers guided collective understanding, interpreting signs in nature and weaving them into tales that educated, cautioned, and inspired. Their narratives mediated between individual experience and collective wisdom, ensuring that knowledge of survival, timing, and cosmic cycles was preserved and communicated effectively. Through this process, stories became repositories of both empirical observation and cultural identity, binding communities together across time and space. These early narratives also laid the foundation for symbolic thought and cultural memory. By associating events in the natural world with characters, plots, and outcomes, humans began to develop abstract thinking. The solstice, as the climax of darkness giving way to light, became a repeated motif, a point of reference for understanding cycles, causality, and transformation. These motifs transcended individual experience, creating shared frameworks for interpreting reality. Through story, early humans were not only surviving, they were cultivating meaning, constructing a cognitive architecture that would support art, ritual, and eventually organized religion. Ultimately, the first stories told around the winter solstice were both practical and philosophical, immediate and timeless. They encoded knowledge of the environment, strategies for survival, and emotional resilience. They projected human experience onto the cosmos, explored abstract concepts like mortality and renewal, and created a shared framework for understanding the world. Through narrative, early humans transformed fear into structure, darkness into reflection, and uncertainty into hope. The solstice became the perfect backdrop for this storytelling, a moment of heightened tension that demanded observation, interpretation, and imagination. It was in these stories that humans first learned to grapple with the unknown, to find meaning in cycles, and to assert continuity in the face of mortality. By weaving observation, memory, and imagination into narratives, humans not only survived the longest nights, they began to understand themselves, their environment, and the rhythms of life in a profoundly reflective way. These early tales laid the groundwork for the myths, rituals, and spiritual traditions that would endure for millennia. In the quiet glow of the solstice fire, humanity discovered the power of story, the ability to confront fear, to encode knowledge, and to glimpse, even in the darkest night, the promise of renewal. The winter solstice, marking the longest night and the slowest, most precarious passage of the year, had a transformative effect not only on the body and mind of early humans but on their emerging sense of self and consciousness. As they huddled together against the cold, tended their fires, and told their stories, people were engaging in something far more profound than mere survival. They were confronting the limits of life and the fragility of hope, and in doing so, they began to reflect on what it meant to exist within a vast and indifferent universe. This reflection was not abstract or academic, it was embodied. Every shiver, every flicker of firelight, every pause as the wind moaned through the trees or across the plains was experienced with acute awareness. The solstice night became a mirror in which humans could see themselves, both as vulnerable creatures and as beings capable of endurance, creativity, and wonder. The physical extremity of the season heightened cognitive and emotional awareness. Hunger sharpened perception, cold focused attention, and the isolation of long nights expanded the mind's capacity for imagination. In darkness, the senses that remained, hearing, smell, touch, became acutely refined. The faint crackle of wood in the fire, the distant howl of a predator, the subtle shift of air through the shelter, all demanded notice. In responding to these stimuli, humans developed heightened observational skills and a sense of situational awareness that was as much psychological as it was practical. The solstice, in this sense, acted as a crucible for consciousness. By pushing the human mind to its limits, the extreme night fostered reflection, imagination, and awareness of one's place in the wider world. In enduring the longest night, humans were learning about themselves, about the environment, and about the delicate balance between life and death. This reflective capacity extended to an understanding of temporality and cycles. Humans began to recognize that the extremes of night and cold were temporary, that the longest night was inevitably followed by the slow return of light. This observation may seem simple from our modern perspective, but in a world without written records or precise tools, it represented a profound conceptual leap. Humans were able to grasp the idea of cyclical time, to see beyond immediate experience, and to anticipate change based on observation and memory. The solstice became a temporal anchor, a point against which all other experiences could be measured and interpreted. It offered reassurance that the worst moments were not permanent and that endurance could yield renewal. In learning to perceive these patterns, early humans were developing one of the foundational elements of abstract thought, the recognition that events could follow predictable rhythms and that the passage of time carried meaning beyond the immediate. The psychological impact of the solstice also fostered a deeper understanding of community and interdependence. In the face of extreme darkness and scarcity, survival required collective effort. The act of tending fires, sharing food, maintaining shelter, and supporting the weak created a social cohesion that was reinforced by the shared intensity of the longest night. These communal experiences were more than practical, they were formative. Humans began to see themselves not just as isolated individuals but as part of a network of relationships, each person's actions affecting the survival of the whole. This realization contributed to the development of empathy, cooperation, and social intelligence, laying the groundwork for cultural and moral frameworks that would emerge in the millennia to come. The solstice, in its extremity, became a laboratory for human psychology, teaching lessons about vulnerability, responsibility, and the power of collective resilience. Moreover, the solstice encouraged early humans to consider existential questions. In the depths of night, confronted by cold, hunger, and darkness, the mind naturally turned inward. Thoughts of mortality, of what might happen if the sun failed to return, and of the fragility of human life were unavoidable. The prolonged stillness of the longest night provided the space for reflection, contemplation, and philosophical inquiry, even if such inquiry was implicit and unstructured. Humans began to form a basic awareness of impermanence, of cycles of life and death, and of the necessity of adaptation and perseverance. These reflections would form the cognitive foundation for later philosophical, spiritual, and religious thought, rooted in the intimate experience of the natural world and its rhythms. The interplay between observation and reflection was crucial. As humans watched the sun sink to its lowest point, as they measured time through the subtle movements of the stars and the moon, and as they observed the survival patterns of animals and plants, they were simultaneously interpreting these phenomena in psychological and symbolic terms. The solstice became a moment in which empirical observation and existential reflection merged. The world was both practical and meaningful, dangerous yet ordered. Humans were learning that the patterns of the cosmos could be read and interpreted, and that understanding these patterns had implications not just for survival but for comprehension of their own existence. The experience of the solstice, therefore, was as much a mental and emotional journey as a physical one. The symbolic significance of the solstice also began to influence early cognitive frameworks. The return of light after the longest night became a metaphor for hope, renewal, and the possibility of transformation. Humans internalized the idea that darkness, whether external or internal, is temporary, and that endurance and attentiveness can bring about positive change. These symbolic associations extended beyond the immediate environment, shaping early conceptualizations of life cycles, death and rebirth, and the balance between vulnerability and resilience. By experiencing and reflecting on the solstice, humans were forming the cognitive scaffolding for abstract thinking, symbolic reasoning, and spiritual insight. In addition, the solstice experience fostered memory and planning. Remembering the patterns of the sun's descent and return required careful attention and recall across days, months, and years. Humans were learning to link past experiences with predictions about future events, an essential cognitive skill for both survival and culture. The ability to anticipate the sun's return, to plan activities around it, and to communicate these patterns through stories and rituals reflects a sophisticated understanding of causality, sequence, and temporal abstraction. The solstice, in effect, trained humans in foresight, memory, and the integration of experience across time, laying the cognitive groundwork for complex societies, ritual, and organized cultural practices. Emotionally, the solstice encouraged resilience. The longest night demanded endurance, but it also offered reward. The slow emergence of dawn, the first weak rays of sun, and the gradual lengthening of days were tangible proofs that perseverance mattered. This cyclical reinforcement of effort and reward shaped psychological responses, teaching patience, hope, and the capacity to endure uncertainty. The solstice became both a challenge and a teacher, demonstrating that even the most extreme adversity is temporary, and that attentive, deliberate engagement with the environment, and with the self, can yield continuity and renewal. Ultimately, the winter solstice was a profound teacher of consciousness. It merged physical experience with reflection, survival with introspection, and observation with imagination. By enduring the longest night, early humans confronted the limits of existence, learned to read patterns in the natural world, and began to cultivate abstract, symbolic, and philosophical thinking. They discovered that life is cyclical, that darkness is finite, and that endurance, observation, and collective effort are essential to survival. In these profound encounters with extreme conditions, humans were not merely responding to the environment, they were shaping cognition, emotion, and culture, laying the foundation for all future exploration of meaning, time, and the human place in the universe. The solstice was thus more than a temporal event, it was a crucible of consciousness, an experiential revelation of human resilience, perception, and the emerging capacity for reflection in the face of both mortality and wonder. The winter solstice was more than a physical phenomenon, it was a portal through which early humans began to understand the intimate relationship between the external world and their inner lives. The darkness of the longest night forced confrontation with fear, scarcity, and uncertainty, but it also created the conditions for introspection, imagination, and emotional depth. Humans, huddled together in the cold and tending their fires, began to realize that the patterns in nature were mirrored within themselves. The cycles of light and dark, birth and death, scarcity and abundance, became metaphors for human experience. In observing the slow return of the sun, they were not merely noting a change in the environment, they were discovering a reflection of their own capacity for resilience, renewal, and inner growth. The solstice illuminated a duality that early humans experienced daily yet rarely articulated, the tension between vulnerability and agency. On one hand, the extreme cold, the encroaching darkness, and the scarcity of resources reminded them of their fragility. Every sound outside the shelter, every shadow cast in the firelight, suggested potential threat. The universe, in its vastness, appeared indifferent to human struggle. Yet, within this very vulnerability, humans discovered power, the power to tend the fire, to share food, to maintain shelter, to communicate knowledge through story, and to anticipate the cycles of nature. The solstice crystallized the realization that while humans could not control every element of the environment, they could exert influence over their responses, their strategies, and their collective resilience. The longest night, therefore, became a teacher of agency, demonstrating that the inner life, vigilance, imagination, cooperation, was as vital as physical survival. These experiences fostered the earliest forms of psychological reflection. In the extended hours of darkness, the mind turned inward. Humans began to examine their fears, their hopes, and their sense of purpose. They contemplated mortality in a way that was immediate and unavoidable. The solstice provided a temporal space in which these reflections could unfold, a night-long mirror in which humans could observe themselves. These introspections were not abstract or detached, they were deeply tied to the survival of the individual and the community. By understanding their own limitations and capacities, humans could make better decisions, anticipate challenges, and navigate the complex social dynamics of their groups. In this way, the solstice was both external and internal, a convergence of environmental observation and self-awareness that shaped cognition and emotional development simultaneously. The solstice also catalyzed the emergence of symbolic thought. Humans began to see parallels between natural cycles and human experience. The sun's apparent struggle to return mirrored the human struggle to endure the cold and darkness. The gradual lengthening of days after the solstice became a metaphor for hope, renewal, and the persistence of life despite adversity. These symbolic associations were encoded in story, ritual, and communal practice. Tales of solar journeys, of animals that disappeared and returned, or of spirits that guarded against darkness, allowed humans to process complex emotions and abstract concepts. Through these narratives, humans externalized internal experiences, creating frameworks for understanding and managing both fear and anticipation. Symbolic thought, in this context, became a tool for psychological survival as well as cultural continuity. The communal aspect of solstice observance reinforced these inner experiences. Humans did not endure the longest night alone. Shared vigilance, collective tending of fires, and the act of storytelling fostered a sense of interdependence and empathy. Individuals learned to recognize the needs, fears, and strengths of others, while the group benefited from shared knowledge and coordinated action. The solstice, therefore, was a crucible for social intelligence, teaching lessons about cooperation, trust, and the emotional dimensions of community life. The internal growth of each member was amplified by the collective, and the collective strength was reinforced by the inner fortitude of each member. In this way, the solstice shaped both personal and social consciousness, intertwining the survival of the self with the survival of the group. Observation of natural cycles further enhanced cognitive sophistication. Early humans noticed that the longest night was not random but predictable. They saw that after the solstice, the sun would rise incrementally higher each day, that animals would reappear in certain patterns, and that plants would begin to show signs of life again. By linking these external patterns to internal experience, fear to endurance, darkness to hope, they were developing the foundations of abstract reasoning. The ability to anticipate, to correlate events across time, and to derive meaning from cyclical patterns was revolutionary. It allowed humans to conceptualize not only immediate survival but also the broader rhythms of existence. The solstice became both a natural clock and a philosophical prompt, guiding thought about life, death, and the continuity of both. Emotion was central to this process. The intensity of the solstice night heightened awareness, magnified feelings, and forced confrontation with existential realities. Humans experienced fear, awe, hope, and relief in rapid succession, creating a dynamic emotional landscape. This emotional richness allowed for complex cognitive processing. The mind had to interpret threats, weigh risks, anticipate changes, and simultaneously seek meaning. The solstice became a laboratory of feeling, an environment that demanded both survival skills and reflective capacity. By navigating these intense experiences, humans were cultivating resilience, patience, and psychological flexibility. The longest night was not merely endured, it was internalized, shaping both temperament and perspective in ways that would echo through generations. The solstice also encouraged ritualization of these experiences. Humans began to formalize the practices that had emerged from repeated observation and reflection. Fires were tended in specific ways, communal gatherings became structured, and stories were told with attention to timing, sequence, and symbolic content. These rituals provided a framework for integrating internal experience with external observation. They offered a shared language for processing fear and hope, for translating the extremes of the environment into meaningful action. Rituals, in this context, were cognitive tools, allowing humans to encode knowledge, manage emotion, and reinforce communal bonds. The solstice, therefore, was both an event and a process, shaping thought, emotion, and culture simultaneously. Memory played a critical role in this development. Humans had to recall previous solstices, observe changes across seasons, and communicate these insights to others. The longest night became a reference point, anchoring temporal understanding and reinforcing continuity. Memory of past endurance, survival strategies, and the slow return of light informed expectations and guided behavior. This cumulative knowledge strengthened both practical competence and psychological confidence. The solstice became a milestone in collective memory, a recurring checkpoint that linked past experience to future anticipation. Through repeated observation and reflection, humans were constructing an early framework for history, forecasting, and cultural transmission, all grounded in the visceral experience of the longest night. Ultimately, the winter solstice served as a bridge between the external world and inner consciousness. Humans learned to perceive patterns in nature, to reflect on mortality and hope, to cultivate emotional resilience, and to integrate social cooperation with individual awareness. The solstice was not simply an environmental event, it was a profound catalyst for self-awareness, symbolic thought, and cultural evolution. By enduring the longest night, early humans discovered that inner life and outer reality were intimately connected, that cycles of darkness and light mirrored cycles of fear and hope, and that survival depended on both physical action and reflective intelligence. The solstice illuminated the emerging human capacity to understand the self, the community, and the cosmos, forging a foundation for consciousness, spirituality, and the profound human pursuit of meaning that would echo through the millennia. As the sun reached its lowest point and the longest night enveloped the world, early humans began to perceive a subtle shift in the environment, a turning point that was at once physical, emotional, and symbolic. The winter solstice was not merely a moment of extreme darkness, it was a hinge upon which the cycle of seasons pivoted. For communities dependent on careful observation of the natural world, this turning point carried profound implications. It signaled that the harshest phase of winter would soon begin to relent, that the days would lengthen gradually, and that life, though still fraught with challenge, would endure. Recognizing this pattern required patience, meticulous observation, and collective knowledge, and it imbued the solstice with a significance that transcended mere survival. It became a moment of anticipation, a pivot between fear and hope, a quiet affirmation that life's cycles were consistent, reliable, and, in their own way, comforting. In the context of early human society, the solstice offered both practical and symbolic reassurance. Practically, understanding the sun's behavior allowed humans to plan for the months ahead, to anticipate the slow return of warmth and light, and to coordinate activities such as hunting, gathering, and preparation for seasonal scarcity. This knowledge reinforced a sense of control over what might otherwise have been an unpredictable and hostile environment. But the solstice also carried symbolic weight. The longest night became a marker of endurance, a tangible demonstration that darkness, no matter how oppressive, was not permanent. Humans internalized this lesson in both conscious and unconscious ways, linking the external cycle of the sun with internal processes of patience, resilience, and hope. The solstice thus served as a natural teacher, instructing not only the body but also the mind and spirit. Emotionally, the solstice was a crucible. The longest night magnified feelings of fear, uncertainty, and vulnerability, yet it also heightened awareness of community, cooperation, and shared experience. The act of tending fires, maintaining shelter, and supporting one another became a collective exercise in endurance. Stories told around the fire carried lessons, reinforced social bonds, and offered psychological sustenance. These narratives often reflected the solstice itself, dramatizing the struggle between darkness and light, scarcity and abundance, fear and hope. By embedding meaning within these stories, humans were able to process complex emotions, anticipate future events, and cultivate a sense of continuity across generations. The solstice was not a passive experience, it was an active engagement with the cycles of nature, a rehearsal for survival, and a means of integrating emotional and cognitive resilience. The solstice also facilitated early forms of ritual and ceremony. Repeated observation of the sun's lowest point likely led to intentional practices designed to honor and mark the event. Fires might have been lit in specific arrangements, gatherings organized around the observation of sunrise, and offerings made to ensure continued favor from the forces represented by the sun. These rituals had multiple functions. They reinforced social cohesion, encoded practical knowledge, and provided a symbolic framework through which humans could engage with existential questions. The solstice thus became both an external event and an internal process, shaping behavior, thought, and belief. Rituals around the solstice helped communities internalize the lessons of endurance and hope, creating patterns of meaning that persisted across generations and reinforced the deep connection between humans and the cosmos. Observation of celestial patterns during the solstice further advanced cognitive development. Early humans began to recognize that the sun's descent and eventual return followed consistent patterns, that the phases of the moon and the positions of stars correlated with environmental changes, and that understanding these cycles could enhance survival. This awareness cultivated foresight, memory, and analytical thinking. The solstice was a natural demonstration of predictability within an unpredictable world. Humans learned to anticipate change, to plan for scarcity, and to encode these lessons within narrative, ritual, and communal practice. This integration of observation, reflection, and practical application represents a foundational step in the evolution of human cognition, combining empirical awareness with symbolic interpretation. Symbolically, the solstice embodies the concept of turning points, both in nature and within human experience. The longest night is also the threshold, the moment when despair is transformed into anticipation. Early humans intuitively grasped that this moment was not static but dynamic, that the sun, though weakened, would return, and that life, though precarious, would endure. This insight likely shaped early cosmologies, mythologies, and spiritual practices. The solstice became a metaphor for renewal, resilience, and the cyclical nature of existence. By linking external phenomena to internal states, humans developed a sophisticated capacity for symbolic thought, recognizing parallels between the cosmos and the human condition, between environmental cycles and personal growth. The solstice also deepened the relationship between humans and the natural world. The prolonged night forced acute awareness of environmental cues, the behavior of animals, the quality of light and temperature, and subtle shifts in weather patterns. By observing these signals, humans could make informed decisions about resource allocation, mobility, and survival strategies. This attentiveness fostered both practical competence and a sense of connection with the rhythms of life. Humans began to perceive themselves as participants within a larger system, subject to its cycles yet capable of understanding and responding to them. The solstice was a concentrated lesson in this relationship, providing a tangible demonstration of interdependence, causality, and the continuity of life. Emotionally and psychologically, the solstice encouraged patience and resilience. The longest night demanded vigilance, attention, and the ability to withstand discomfort. Humans learned that endurance had intrinsic value, that remaining alert, maintaining communal structures, and preserving hope through narrative and ritual directly impacted survival. This repeated engagement with extreme conditions reinforced emotional regulation, delayed gratification, and strategic thinking. The solstice, therefore, was not merely an environmental milestone but a developmental crucible, shaping human temperament, emotional intelligence, and cognitive sophistication. By surviving the darkest night and witnessing the return of light, humans internalized lessons about the stability of cycles, the reliability of effort, and the possibility of renewal even after profound challenge. The solstice also catalyzed a profound awareness of temporality. Humans began to distinguish between immediate experience and long-term patterns, observing that the present difficulty was finite and that the future promised change. This recognition of cyclical time contributed to memory, planning, and the anticipation of events, essential skills for survival and social organization. The solstice anchored human consciousness in time, providing a predictable reference point around which cultural, emotional, and cognitive frameworks could be organized. By situating experience within cycles, humans were able to integrate past observation, present action, and future anticipation, creating a coherent sense of continuity in a world otherwise dominated by uncertainty. Ultimately, the winter solstice was both a practical and existential turning point. It combined environmental observation, emotional intensity, communal engagement, and symbolic insight, forging lessons that extended far beyond the immediate experience of the longest night. Humans learned to anticipate change, endure hardship, and find meaning in cycles. They discovered that darkness is temporary, that vigilance and cooperation are essential, and that observation and reflection can transform fear into hope. The solstice became a framework through which early humans could integrate the physical, emotional, and cognitive dimensions of existence, linking survival with understanding, observation with imagination, and immediate experience with enduring patterns. In this way, the solstice was not merely a moment in time, it was a crucible of human consciousness, a threshold between despair and hope, and a foundational experience in the development of symbolic thought, communal life, and reflective awareness that would shape the trajectory of humanity for millennia. The return of light after the longest night was more than a simple astronomical event, it was a profound emotional and psychological milestone for early humans. After enduring the darkness, cold, and scarcity of the winter solstice, the gradual lengthening of days brought not only physical relief but also a deep sense of hope and renewal. The first weak rays of the sun piercing through the horizon were experienced with an intensity that modern humans can scarcely imagine. Every increment of light was a tangible affirmation that survival was possible, that the cycles of the universe were reliable, and that the endurance of the community and the individual had meaning. This slow return of illumination was a catalyst for reflection, celebration, and the crystallization of symbolic understanding, linking the observable world with the inner experience of hope and resilience. The emergence of light had immediate practical consequences. Longer days allowed for extended periods of activity, making it possible to hunt, gather, and prepare for the remainder of winter with greater efficiency. Resources could be replenished, shelters repaired, and social activities expanded. Beyond mere survival, the return of light provided a psychological reprieve, reducing stress and anxiety that had accumulated during the longest night. Humans experienced a profound relief, a release of tension, and an affirmation of their ability to endure extreme conditions. The shift from darkness to light created a natural rhythm that structured daily life, instilling patterns of behavior, observation, and expectation that were essential for both individual and communal survival. Emotionally, the first light after the solstice carried symbolic significance. It became a metaphor for renewal, resilience, and the promise of continuity. Humans, having endured the harshest conditions, could interpret the return of the sun as proof that effort, vigilance, and cooperation were rewarded. This observation was not merely pragmatic, it shaped the psyche. The sun's return reinforced the understanding that cycles govern existence, that darkness is finite, and that life can endure even in the face of overwhelming adversity. In this way, the solstice and the subsequent lengthening of days offered early humans both a temporal marker and a psychological framework, linking external events with internal states of hope, confidence, and emotional stability. The return of light also provided a platform for ritual and celebration. Communities likely gathered to observe the sunrise, to tend fires in symbolic patterns, and to engage in collective storytelling. These rituals were both expressions of gratitude and acts of cultural reinforcement, embedding lessons about survival, cooperation, and the cycles of nature into communal memory. The solstice, once a time of tension and vigilance, became a period of recognition and affirmation. The community could collectively witness the resilience of life and the reliability of the environment, strengthening social bonds and reinforcing shared understanding. These gatherings transformed the natural phenomenon of the sun's return into a profound cultural and emotional experience, intertwining practical observation with symbolic meaning. The psychological impact of the sun's gradual return was profound. Humans had confronted vulnerability and fear during the longest night, and the emerging light validated their efforts, endurance, and cooperation. This reinforcement strengthened cognitive and emotional capacities, fostering resilience, patience, and anticipation. The return of light demonstrated that time and effort mattered, that endurance had tangible outcomes, and that the universe, though vast and often indifferent, followed patterns that could be understood and relied upon. This combination of empirical observation and symbolic interpretation contributed to the development of abstract thinking, allowing humans to conceptualize cause and effect, temporal continuity, and the interdependence of action and consequence. Observing the sun's re-emergence also shaped early metaphysical and spiritual thought. The gradual increase in daylight could easily be interpreted as the triumph of light over darkness, of life over death, and of hope over despair. Humans began to assign symbolic significance to these cycles, connecting physical phenomena with psychological and spiritual insights. The sun became a central figure in emerging cosmologies, myths, and ritual practices, representing renewal, strength, and the assurance of continuity. Through observation, interpretation, and ritual, early humans were creating frameworks of meaning that allowed them to navigate uncertainty, understand their place in the cosmos, and embed experience within culturally transmitted narratives. The solstice and the return of light thus became foundational in the development of symbolic thought and the human capacity for spiritual reflection. Memory and observation played crucial roles in this process. Humans who survived the solstice and witnessed the slow increase in daylight could communicate their observations to others, encoding knowledge in both oral traditions and ritualized behaviors. These practices allowed subsequent generations to anticipate the turning point of darkness, to understand the rhythm of seasons, and to integrate this understanding into social and survival strategies. The solstice thus became a reference point not only for practical action but also for collective memory, reinforcing continuity across generations. By linking observation of the natural world with communal practice and symbolic interpretation, humans were developing complex cognitive structures that integrated survival, reflection, and cultural identity. The return of light also highlighted the intimate connection between environment and consciousness. Humans began to perceive patterns not only in external phenomena but also in internal experience. The shift from darkness to light mirrored shifts in emotional and psychological states. Fear and anxiety gave way to relief and hope, tension relaxed into reflection and anticipation, isolation transformed into communal engagement. The environment and the mind were experienced as interconnected, and humans began to recognize that survival and well-being depended on awareness, interpretation, and response to both. The solstice, therefore, served as a profound lesson in the interplay between external conditions and internal perception, reinforcing the human capacity for self-awareness, adaptation, and resilience. The cyclical nature of light and dark also encouraged philosophical and symbolic reasoning. Early humans began to understand that extremes are temporary, that cycles repeat, and that endurance is rewarded. This recognition laid the groundwork for conceptual frameworks that would later evolve into cosmology, theology, and philosophy. By witnessing the slow but inevitable return of the sun, humans internalized the idea that life is governed by recurring patterns, that endings are not final, and that hope and effort have intrinsic value. The solstice and the lengthening of days became metaphors for renewal, transformation, and the continuity of existence. These metaphors would shape not only practical behavior but also the emerging human sense of purpose, meaning, and moral reasoning. Emotionally, the return of light created a profound sense of awe and wonder. The first rays of sun piercing the horizon after the darkest night were experienced as miraculous, tangible proof of endurance and the reliability of natural cycles. This awe was not passive, it was active, motivating humans to observe, reflect, and participate in the continuity of life. The interplay of anticipation, endurance, and reward created a rich emotional landscape in which humans could explore fear, relief, hope, and joy. These emotional experiences were codified into narrative, ritual, and cultural practice, reinforcing both cognitive and social development. The solstice, through its darkness and subsequent illumination, became a concentrated experience of life's extremes, teaching lessons about the interplay between adversity, effort, and renewal. Ultimately, the return of light after the solstice was transformative. It validated endurance, reinforced social bonds, and deepened the understanding of cycles and patterns. Humans learned to link external observation with internal reflection, to encode knowledge through ritual and story, and to find meaning in the predictable rhythms of nature. The solstice and the gradual return of light exemplified the convergence of survival, cognition, emotion, and symbolism. It was a turning point not only in the natural year but in the evolution of human consciousness, shaping the capacity for hope, reflection, and the search for meaning. In witnessing the first rays of the sun after the longest night, humans experienced the profound intersection of environment, community, and inner life, forging lessons in resilience, renewal, and the enduring potential of both nature and the human spirit. The emergence of light after the longest night was not only a physical transition but also a deeply symbolic and psychological event for early humans. The winter solstice marked a pivot point, a moment when darkness began to recede and the cycles of nature revealed their inherent order and reliability. This slow return of illumination provided a powerful contrast to the fears and uncertainties experienced during the longest night, and it offered humans an opportunity to reflect on endurance, survival, and the profound interconnectedness between their inner lives and the external world. In the weeks following the solstice, communities witnessed the incremental lengthening of days, and with each passing sunrise, they internalized lessons about resilience, continuity, and the rhythms of existence. The environment itself became a teacher, and the cyclical nature of light and dark provided an experiential framework for understanding both the cosmos and the human condition. The practical implications of this gradual return of light were significant. Extended daylight allowed early humans to forage more effectively, track the movement of animals, repair or expand shelters, and engage in social interactions that were more challenging during prolonged darkness. Every hour of additional sunlight offered opportunities to secure resources and reinforce communal structures. These tangible benefits reinforced the connection between observation and action, teaching humans that attentiveness to natural patterns directly impacted survival. The sun's return was thus both a literal and symbolic reward, confirming that persistence, patience, and cooperation were meaningful strategies for enduring the harshest periods of winter. The solstice, once a time of tension, transformed into a period of affirmation and preparation, demonstrating the interplay between natural cycles and human agency. The psychological impact of this transition was profound. After enduring the longest night, individuals experienced a mixture of relief, hope, and awe as the sun reasserted itself on the horizon. These emotions were deeply intertwined with the cognitive understanding that the environment operated in predictable cycles. The incremental return of light offered reassurance that extreme conditions were temporary and that the passage of time brought renewal. This recognition strengthened both emotional resilience and reflective capacity. Humans began to anticipate positive change, to see effort rewarded, and to integrate experience into a broader understanding of temporal patterns. The solstice, therefore, was not merely an astronomical event. It was a concentrated lesson in the relationship between time, effort, and the reliability of natural processes, fostering a nuanced understanding of cause, effect, and expectation. Symbolism became a central aspect of human interpretation during this period. The sun, returning gradually after its perceived nadir, was easily conceptualized as a living force, a deity, or a cosmic presence engaged in struggle and eventual triumph. By projecting human qualities onto celestial phenomena, early humans were practicing the earliest forms of symbolic reasoning. This projection allowed them to make sense of the extremes of their environment and to find continuity and meaning in cycles that might otherwise seem indifferent or threatening. The solstice became a metaphor for endurance and renewal, illustrating that even the most intense darkness inevitably gives way to light. These symbolic associations were internalized and transmitted through story, ritual, and communal observation, laying the groundwork for mythological frameworks that would endure for millennia. Ritual practices surrounding the solstice intensified during the period following the return of light. Communities likely engaged in collective ceremonies, storytelling, and acts of symbolic offering to honor the sun's return. These rituals served multiple purposes. They reinforced social cohesion, codified observational knowledge, and provided a framework for psychological reassurance. Through these shared activities, humans not only acknowledged the environmental transition but also embedded it within cultural and spiritual consciousness. The rituals created continuity between generations, teaching that communal action and attentiveness to natural cycles were integral to survival. They transformed the solstice from a simple environmental event into a profound communal experience, linking observation, emotion, and symbolic interpretation. The solstice also enhanced humans' understanding of cyclical time. By observing the sun's gradual return, humans could anticipate seasonal shifts and plan for future challenges. This capacity for foresight marked a significant cognitive advancement. It required the integration of memory, observation, and abstract reasoning, recalling the patterns of previous years, noting incremental changes, and predicting outcomes based on experience. The solstice thus acted as a natural temporal anchor, helping early humans construct frameworks for anticipating environmental patterns and coordinating communal activity. These observations contributed not only to practical survival but also to the development of cognitive skills such as sequencing, pattern recognition, and the conceptualization of continuity and change over time. Emotionally, the return of light reinforced the interdependence of the individual and the community. The longest night had demanded cooperation and vigilance. Now, as days lengthened, the rewards of collective effort became tangible. The reinforcement of social bonds through shared observation, celebration, and ritual fostered trust, empathy, and cohesion. Early humans recognized that survival was both a personal and collective endeavor, and the solstice experience amplified this understanding. Communities learned that their success was inseparable from coordinated effort, attentiveness, and shared resilience. The gradual illumination of the environment mirrored the illumination of consciousness, highlighting the interconnectedness of survival, sociality, and symbolic thought. Observation of the natural world during this period deepened the human capacity for abstraction and metaphor. The incremental light following the solstice mirrored the emotional and psychological processes of endurance and hope. Humans began to understand that external cycles could reflect internal states, and that survival involved not only physical action but also mental and emotional regulation. The solstice provided a concentrated lesson in this relationship, demonstrating that attentiveness to subtle changes in the environment could yield insights into patterns of life, resilience, and renewal. By internalizing these lessons, humans were developing the cognitive scaffolding necessary for symbolic thought, narrative construction, and reflective awareness. Memory and narrative played critical roles in consolidating these experiences. Stories about the return of the sun, about survival during the darkest night, and about the cyclical nature of life were shared around communal fires, embedding both empirical knowledge and emotional insight within cultural consciousness. These narratives served as educational tools, moral guides, and repositories of observation, ensuring that the lessons of the solstice were transmitted across generations. In this way, the experience of light following darkness became a foundational element of human culture, linking practical survival with symbolic meaning, and reinforcing the continuity of knowledge, ritual, and collective identity. The solstice also catalyzed early philosophical reflection. By observing the transition from extreme darkness to increasing light, humans began to perceive patterns of struggle, endurance, and reward. They recognized that challenges were temporary, that effort and vigilance were meaningful, and that cycles of adversity and renewal were inherent to existence. This awareness formed the basis for abstract reasoning, moral reflection, and symbolic thought. The solstice and its aftermath provided a concentrated model for understanding life's rhythms, embedding lessons about resilience, anticipation, and hope within both the psyche and the social fabric. Ultimately, the period following the winter solstice was transformative in every dimension: practical, psychological, social, and symbolic. The return of light validated endurance, reinforced communal bonds, and deepened awareness of temporal cycles. Humans integrated observation with reflection, survival with meaning, and action with symbolism. The solstice became a natural laboratory in which the interplay of environment, consciousness, and culture was intensely concentrated, teaching lessons that would echo across generations. By witnessing the gradual illumination of the world after the longest night, early humans internalized profound truths: darkness is finite, cycles are reliable, effort is meaningful, and life is resilient. In this interplay between environmental change and human response, the solstice forged foundational capacities for reflection, symbolism, and cultural continuity that would shape the trajectory of humanity for millennia to come. The return of light after the winter solstice was more than a seasonal change, it was an existential revelation, a moment in which early humans began to perceive the profound interconnectedness between the cycles of nature and the cycles within themselves. For countless generations, the solstice had been a time of extreme darkness, when the sun lingered at its lowest point and the night stretched unnervingly long. These nights were physically demanding and psychologically intense, demanding vigilance, patience, and resilience. The gradual lengthening of days, beginning almost imperceptibly, was therefore experienced not merely as a physical relief but as a profound affirmation of the continuity of life. Every inch of additional light carried symbolic weight, a demonstration that the harshest trials were temporary, that patterns in nature were reliable, and that human endurance and attentiveness were meaningful. This slow illumination transformed the environment from an arena of survival into a canvas upon which early humans projected meaning, reflection, and anticipation. The psychological dimensions of this transition were extraordinary. After enduring nights filled with cold, hunger, and uncertainty, the emerging light offered more than visibility, it offered reassurance, hope, and emotional release. Individuals could begin to perceive the relationship between their efforts during the longest night, maintaining fire, gathering food, supporting others, and the rewards that emerged with the lengthening day. The sun's return became a tangible proof of resilience, illustrating the link between perseverance and outcome. These experiences laid the foundation for a sophisticated understanding of cause and effect, patience, and strategic planning. Early humans were beginning to learn that action mattered, that observation informed decisions, and that endurance had both practical and symbolic significance. The solstice, in its slow revelation of light, became a teacher of both survival and philosophical insight, demonstrating that even the most oppressive darkness yields to persistence and attentiveness. Communal life was profoundly shaped by the gradual return of the sun. During the longest nights, communities had been bound together by the shared demands of survival, tending fires, maintaining shelters, and supporting the vulnerable. The first rays of sunlight were therefore experienced collectively, reinforcing social bonds and shared understanding. Celebratory gatherings may have occurred around fires, with stories, songs, and rituals marking the transition from darkness to light. These communal practices reinforced cohesion, transmitted knowledge, and embedded lessons about the interdependence of individuals within the group. The solstice became not only an environmental event but a social and cultural milestone, one in which the rhythms of nature were mirrored in human relationships and collective consciousness. The interplay between observation, reflection, and shared experience helped solidify the foundations of culture, ritual, and community identity. Symbolism was central to the human understanding of this phenomenon. The sun, returning after its perceived lowest point, was often anthropomorphized or deified, conceived as a living force engaged in struggle and renewal. The slow elongation of daylight could be interpreted as the triumph of life over adversity, light over darkness, and hope over despair. Early humans projected their own experiences onto the sun's journey, using it as a mirror for understanding their endurance, vulnerability, and resilience. This symbolic framework allowed them to navigate the emotional intensity of the solstice with meaning, turning existential anxiety into narrative, metaphor, and ritual. Stories told around fires, describing solar journeys, the resilience of animals, or the interplay of forces in nature, became repositories for both empirical observation and emotional insight. These narratives codified lessons in survival, reflection, and morality, blending practical knowledge with symbolic thought in ways that would shape human culture for millennia. The cognitive implications of observing the sun's return were profound. Early humans were required to track subtle changes over days and weeks, noting the incremental increase in daylight and the corresponding shifts in temperature, animal behavior, and plant activity. This required attention to detail, memory, and the ability to integrate observations over time. In turn, these skills enhanced predictive capacity and foresight, allowing humans to anticipate future conditions and adjust behavior accordingly. The solstice thus served as a training ground for complex cognitive functions, linking immediate experience with long-term planning, observation with abstract reasoning, and environmental awareness with emotional intelligence. Humans were not merely reacting to the environment, they were interpreting it, anticipating patterns, and internalizing lessons about resilience, cycles, and consequence. Emotionally, the gradual return of light reinforced a sense of temporal continuity and stability. The longest night had represented the apex of adversity, a moment in which fear, uncertainty, and vulnerability were most acute. The incremental emergence of sunlight confirmed that these extremes were temporary, that cycles could be relied upon, and that effort and vigilance were meaningful. This experience provided an emotional framework for understanding and regulating fear, anxiety, and hope. Humans learned to endure difficulty with the expectation of eventual reward, to navigate uncertainty with patience, and to recognize the reliability of natural patterns. The solstice, therefore, was not only a test of survival but a concentrated lesson in emotional resilience, self-regulation, and the capacity for reflective anticipation. Ritualization of the solstice further reinforced these lessons. As humans observed the slow increase of light, they may have developed ceremonies to honor the sun's return, to codify observation, and to reinforce communal bonds. Fires could have been arranged in symbolic patterns, collective storytelling performed, and offerings made to ensure continuity and protection. These rituals transformed observation into cultural practice, embedding knowledge of cycles, endurance, and renewal into social memory. The solstice became both an environmental and cultural marker, linking the physical phenomena of the sun with human cognition, emotion, and symbolic expression. Through these practices, the solstice was encoded into the collective consciousness, shaping identity, morality, and understanding across generations. Memory played a crucial role in consolidating the lessons of the solstice. Humans needed to recall the duration of the longest night, the patterns of sunrise and sunset, and the behaviors of animals and plants associated with seasonal change. These recollections were communicated orally, through story, song, and ritual, creating continuity between generations and reinforcing cultural knowledge. The solstice thus became a temporal anchor, linking past experience with present observation and future anticipation. By internalizing these lessons, humans developed a framework for understanding cycles, cause and effect, and the relationship between effort and outcome. The return of light was not a singular event but a repeated, observable phenomenon that provided a consistent basis for learning, reflection, and cultural transmission. The solstice also shaped early philosophical reasoning. By observing the cyclical return of the sun, humans began to perceive patterns in adversity and reward, darkness and light, fear and hope. They recognized that extremes are temporary, that effort and endurance are meaningful, and that cycles govern both the external world and internal experience. This awareness encouraged abstract thought, symbolic reasoning, and moral reflection. The solstice became a model for understanding existence itself, offering a lens through which humans could interpret life's challenges, opportunities, and transformations. The interplay between environmental observation and internal reflection provided a foundational structure for the development of human consciousness, spirituality, and ethical awareness. Ultimately, the period following the winter solstice represented a convergence of survival, cognition, emotion, and symbolism. The gradual return of light validated endurance, reinforced social bonds, and deepened understanding of temporal cycles. Humans integrated practical observation with emotional reflection, narrative construction, and ritualized behavior. The solstice became a concentrated experience of life's rhythms, offering lessons in resilience, anticipation, and the meaning of cyclical change. By witnessing and internalizing the incremental emergence of the sun after the longest night, humans forged the foundations of abstract thought, communal culture, and symbolic interpretation. In this delicate interplay between darkness and light, between effort and reward, early humans discovered enduring truths about existence, continuity, and the capacity for hope, a legacy that would echo throughout human history. The return of the sun after the winter solstice was not merely a change in the natural environment, it represented a profound awakening of consciousness and imagination in early humans. For countless generations, the solstice marked the apex of darkness, a night so long and chilling that it forced humans to confront the fragility of life, the limits of their endurance, and the precariousness of survival. As the days gradually lengthened, the slow emergence of light offered tangible proof that the universe followed patterns, that adversity was temporary, and that resilience and attentiveness could yield results. This incremental illumination was deeply intertwined with emotional, social, and cognitive development, shaping the way humans perceived themselves, their communities, and the cosmos. Each sunrise became more than a physical event, it was a mirror reflecting inner fortitude, collective effort, and the promise of continuity. Practically, the return of light had immediate implications for survival. Longer days allowed humans to extend their activities beyond the confines of shelter, to forage and hunt more efficiently, to observe environmental changes, and to prepare for the challenges of the remaining winter months. This extension of productive time was critical in regions where resources were scarce and the margin for error narrow. Every additional hour of light was a resource in itself, offering opportunities to reinforce communal infrastructure, repair shelters, and coordinate collective action. By linking the gradual increase of daylight to practical strategies for survival, early humans developed an acute awareness of the relationship between observation, timing, and action. The solstice was both a temporal and environmental anchor, offering lessons in anticipation, planning, and the coordination of effort. Emotionally, the return of light provided relief and a renewed sense of hope. After the psychological intensity of the longest night, which amplified fear, vulnerability, and uncertainty, the first signs of sunrise offered reassurance. Humans began to associate the emergence of light with reward and continuity, linking effort during hardship to positive outcomes. This emotional reinforcement strengthened resilience, patience, and adaptive capacity. It encouraged humans to persevere through adversity, to trust in the reliability of natural cycles, and to recognize that vigilance and cooperation mattered. The solstice thus became a concentrated lesson in emotional intelligence, teaching humans how to endure, anticipate, and find hope even in extreme conditions. Symbolism became a critical lens through which humans interpreted the return of light. The sun, rising after its perceived nadir, was often imbued with agency, character, or divinity. Humans projected qualities onto it: resilience, struggle, triumph, creating narratives that connected the physical environment with the internal life of the community. The incremental return of light became a metaphor for renewal, endurance, and the triumph of life over adversity. These symbolic associations were embedded into ritual, storytelling, and communal practice, allowing humans to process intense experiences, convey essential knowledge, and transmit cultural values across generations. The solstice was no longer merely an environmental event, it became a narrative and symbolic touchstone, a point at which observation, emotion, and cultural expression converged. The social dimension of the solstice was equally significant. Humans did not experience the return of light in isolation. The collective endurance of darkness, tending of fires, maintenance of shelters, and sharing of scarce resources had already reinforced social bonds. As light returned, these communal achievements were validated and celebrated. Shared rituals, storytelling, and acts of symbolic acknowledgement helped solidify cooperation, trust, and interdependence. The solstice became a cultural event, integrating environmental observation with social cohesion. By linking survival with community effort and symbolic interpretation, early humans reinforced the value of cooperation, empathy, and collective resilience. The solstice thus shaped social intelligence, teaching humans to recognize their interconnectedness and the importance of mutual support in navigating the challenges of life. Observation of the environment during this period enhanced cognitive sophistication. Humans noted subtle changes in daylight, temperature, animal behavior, and plant life. They connected these observations to patterns of survival, planning, and cultural practice. The solstice offered a concrete example of cause and effect, reinforcing the value of attentiveness, memory, and predictive reasoning. Humans were learning to anticipate change, to interpret environmental signals, and to integrate these insights into practical and symbolic frameworks. The solstice became a classroom for complex cognition, where observation, memory, and abstract reasoning intersected. The gradual return of light trained humans not only to survive but to understand cycles, patterns, and relationships between the self, the community, and the natural world. The emotional and symbolic lessons of the solstice were deeply intertwined with cognition. The slow increase in daylight mirrored human psychological processes, fear giving way to hope, uncertainty giving way to reassurance, and vulnerability giving way to empowerment. Humans began to internalize the idea that challenges are temporary, that perseverance is rewarded, and that natural cycles offer guidance for both survival and reflection. This understanding fostered the early development of symbolic thought, narrative construction, and reflective consciousness. The solstice taught that external events could reflect internal realities and that human experience could be interpreted through patterns observed in the environment. Ritualization during this period reinforced these lessons. Fires could be arranged in specific formations, communal storytelling performed, and symbolic acts executed to honor the sun's return. These rituals codified observation, emotion, and cultural understanding into repeatable practices. They ensured that knowledge of seasonal cycles, survival strategies, and symbolic meaning was preserved across generations. The solstice became both an environmental and cultural milestone, embedding practical, emotional, and philosophical insights into the collective consciousness. By integrating observation, ritual, and narrative, early humans transformed the return of light into a framework for understanding the world, themselves, and their place within it. Memory was central to this process. Humans needed to remember the duration of the longest night, the patterns of sunrise and sunset, and the associated behaviors of plants and animals. These memories were communicated through stories, rituals, and communal observation, creating continuity across generations. The solstice became a reference point in temporal understanding, a milestone that anchored experience, planning, and cultural knowledge. Through memory, humans learned to link past experience with present observation and future anticipation, constructing frameworks for both survival and symbolic interpretation. Philosophically, the solstice and the return of light encouraged reflection on the nature of cycles, continuity, and transformation. Humans began to perceive patterns not only in the environment but in life itself. The solstice offered evidence that extremes are temporary, that endurance is meaningful, and that renewal is possible. It created a conceptual framework through which humans could explore abstract ideas such as impermanence, hope, and the interplay between adversity and reward. These insights laid the foundation for symbolic reasoning, moral reflection, and spiritual thought, integrating observation, experience, and narrative into a coherent understanding of existence. Ultimately, the period following the winter solstice represented a convergence of environmental, cognitive, emotional, social, and symbolic development. The incremental return of light validated endurance, reinforced community, and deepened understanding of temporal and natural cycles. Humans integrated observation with reflection, survival with meaning, and action with symbolism. The solstice became a concentrated lesson in resilience, continuity, and hope, providing a template for understanding the world, the self, and the community. By witnessing and internalizing the slow re-emergence of the sun, early humans discovered enduring truths about the cyclical nature of life, the value of persistence, and the interconnection between environmental patterns and human consciousness, laying the groundwork for myth, ritual, and reflective awareness that would shape culture for generations. The period following the winter solstice was not only a time of physical adaptation but also a profound moment of cognitive and emotional expansion for early humans. The lengthening of days after the longest night offered a rhythm that was at once practical, psychological, and symbolic. The return of light after prolonged darkness brought relief, but it also encouraged reflection, observation, and the development of a nuanced understanding of cycles, patterns, and interconnectedness. Humans, having endured the most extreme part of winter, began to link the gradual emergence of daylight with both survival strategies and deeper contemplations about life, resilience, and renewal. Each day, as the sun rose higher and lingered longer, it offered lessons in endurance, anticipation, and the intricate dance between adversity and relief, illuminating not only the physical world but the inner landscape of thought and emotion. Practically, the increasing daylight expanded the window of opportunity for essential activities. Hunting and foraging became more productive, enabling communities to secure food and resources that had been scarce during the dark months. Repairing shelters, preparing tools, and observing environmental changes could be accomplished with greater precision and efficiency. Each incremental increase in sunlight reinforced the understanding that careful observation and measured effort yielded tangible results. Early humans learned to synchronize their behavior with the environment, developing strategies for survival that were informed by experience, memory, and foresight. The solstice thus functioned as both a temporal and practical guide, teaching humans the importance of timing, patience, and attentiveness in navigating their surroundings. Emotionally, the return of light offered profound relief and reassurance. After enduring the anxiety, fear, and uncertainty of the longest night, the gradual illumination of the world validated human effort and cooperation. Individuals experienced a mix of awe, hope, and psychological release, recognizing that the worst of adversity had passed and that life could continue. This emotional reinforcement was crucial for resilience, fostering patience, optimism, and the capacity to endure future challenges. The solstice provided a concentrated lesson in emotional regulation, demonstrating that persistence and vigilance were meaningful and that the rhythms of nature could be trusted as guides for action and reflection. Symbolically, the solstice and the subsequent lengthening of days became a source of meaning and narrative. The sun's incremental return after its perceived nadir could be interpreted as a triumph of life over darkness, hope over despair, and continuity over uncertainty. Early humans projected human qualities onto the sun, seeing in its journey a reflection of struggle, endurance, and eventual renewal. These symbolic interpretations were expressed through storytelling, ritual, and communal celebration, embedding lessons about survival, patience, and resilience into cultural consciousness. The solstice thus became more than an environmental event, it was a canvas for reflection, imagination, and symbolic thought, linking external observation with inner awareness and emotional understanding. The social dimension of the solstice was equally significant. Communities had relied on collective effort to survive the longest nights, and the return of light validated and reinforced these cooperative practices. Shared activities, storytelling, and ritual celebration strengthened social bonds, reinforced empathy, and highlighted the interdependence of group members. The solstice became a communal experience, integrating observation, survival, and symbolic expression into shared practice. This period taught humans that survival was inseparable from social cohesion, and that cooperation and mutual support were essential for enduring environmental extremes. The interplay between communal observation, emotional reinforcement, and symbolic interpretation provided a rich foundation for social intelligence, moral understanding, and collective resilience. Observation of environmental patterns during this period further advanced cognitive abilities. Humans noted subtle changes in daylight, temperature, animal behavior, and plant life, linking these observations to survival strategies and seasonal planning. The solstice offered a concrete example of cause and effect, illustrating that careful attention to natural patterns could yield reliable predictions and practical benefits. This process required memory, attention to detail, and the capacity for abstraction, laying the groundwork for predictive reasoning, temporal understanding, and symbolic thought. By integrating empirical observation with reflection and communal knowledge, early humans were developing the cognitive scaffolding for planning, problem-solving, and cultural continuity. Emotionally and psychologically, the solstice encouraged the integration of external and internal experience. The incremental return of light mirrored shifts in human perception and emotion. Fear and anxiety gave way to relief and hope, vulnerability gave way to empowerment, and isolation gave way to communal cohesion. This alignment of environmental change with psychological processes allowed humans to internalize lessons about resilience, patience, and the value of sustained effort. The solstice became a concentrated training ground for emotional intelligence, teaching humans how to regulate responses, anticipate outcomes, and draw meaning from experience. Ritual practices around the solstice reinforced these lessons. Fires could be arranged symbolically, storytelling structured around the cycle of light and darkness, and offerings performed to honor the sun's return. These rituals codified observation, memory, and symbolic meaning into communal practice, ensuring that knowledge of survival, seasonal patterns, and moral lessons was preserved and transmitted across generations. The solstice became both an environmental and cultural milestone, linking natural phenomena with human cognition, social structures, and symbolic interpretation. By participating in these rituals, humans internalized lessons about cycles, resilience, and continuity, embedding them into the shared cultural consciousness. Memory and narrative were central to the solstice's impact. Humans needed to recall the duration of the longest night, the incremental return of light, and associated behaviors of animals and plants. These recollections were transmitted through storytelling, song, and ritual, creating continuity between generations. The solstice functioned as a temporal anchor, linking past experience with present observation and future anticipation. By embedding these patterns into memory and narrative, humans developed the ability to plan, teach, and reflect on experience, integrating practical survival strategies with emotional and symbolic understanding. The solstice also fostered philosophical and symbolic reasoning. By observing the transition from darkness to light, humans began to perceive patterns of adversity, endurance, and reward. They recognized that extremes are temporary, that persistence is meaningful, and that life follows cyclical rhythms. These insights laid the foundation for abstract thought, moral reflection, and the creation of symbolic frameworks that could guide behavior, emotion, and community life. The solstice provided a model for understanding the interplay between effort and outcome, challenge and renewal, despair and hope, offering lessons that extended beyond immediate survival to the broader realm of meaning and reflection. Ultimately, the period following the winter solstice represented a convergence of practical, cognitive, emotional, social, and symbolic development. The gradual return of light validated endurance, reinforced communal bonds, and deepened understanding of natural and temporal cycles. Humans integrated observation with reflection, survival with meaning, and action with symbolic interpretation. The solstice became a concentrated experience of life's rhythms, teaching lessons about resilience, anticipation, and the continuity of existence. By witnessing and internalizing the incremental return of the sun, early humans forged foundational capacities for abstract thought, communal cohesion, emotional intelligence, and symbolic reasoning. In this interplay between darkness and light, adversity and renewal, humans discovered enduring truths about survival, hope, and the profound connections between the external world, the community, and the inner landscape of consciousness, laying the groundwork for culture, ritual, and reflective awareness that would shape human history for generations to come. The period following the winter solstice marked a profound transformation in the way early humans perceived the natural world, themselves, and their place within the cycles of existence. The longest night had demanded vigilance, cooperation, and endurance, shaping both practical survival skills and emotional resilience. As the sun gradually began its ascent and the days lengthened incrementally, humans experienced a tangible shift in their environment, a shift that was mirrored in their inner lives. Each increase in daylight was not merely a physical relief, it was an affirmation that life persisted, that patterns in nature were reliable, and that endurance and attention to detail yielded results. The solstice became a fulcrum point, a moment in which humans could witness the interplay between environmental forces, social cohesion, and the unfolding of time, creating an experiential framework that shaped cognition, emotion, and culture simultaneously. Practically, the return of light provided critical advantages. Extended daylight hours allowed communities to hunt, gather, and process food with greater efficiency, enabling the replenishment of resources depleted during the longest nights. It offered opportunities to repair shelters, sharpen tools, and observe environmental cues with greater precision. Every additional hour of sunlight was a resource in itself, reinforcing the connection between observation, action, and survival. Humans learned to anticipate changes in the environment, to coordinate activities with others, and to leverage the predictable rhythms of the sun and seasons for practical gain. In this way, the solstice functioned as both a temporal anchor and a guide for action, teaching lessons in foresight, planning, and the interdependence of effort and outcome. Emotionally, the return of light carried profound significance. The long nights had amplified fear, vulnerability, and uncertainty, but the incremental emergence of daylight offered relief, reassurance, and hope. Humans experienced a deep sense of renewal as they observed the first rays of sunlight gradually extending the day. This experience reinforced the understanding that adversity is finite, that effort and vigilance matter, and that cycles in nature can be trusted as guides. The solstice thus became a concentrated lesson in emotional resilience, teaching humans to endure hardship, anticipate improvement, and recognize the value of persistence. The psychological effects of witnessing the sun's gradual return laid the foundation for reflective thought, optimism, and the capacity to draw meaning from experience. The symbolic dimensions of the solstice were equally significant. Early humans likely projected human qualities onto the sun, viewing its gradual return as a form of struggle and triumph that mirrored their own experiences. The incremental increase in daylight could be interpreted as a metaphor for hope, renewal, and the triumph of life over darkness. Such symbolic reasoning allowed humans to process intense emotions, link environmental patterns with inner experience, and construct narratives that embedded lessons about survival, resilience, and the cyclical nature of existence. These interpretations became integral to the culture, expressed through storytelling, communal ritual, and symbolic action. The solstice was no longer simply an observable event in the environment, it became a narrative and symbolic milestone that guided both cognition and emotion. Socially, the solstice reinforced the value of cooperation and collective experience. The longest nights had demanded shared effort, maintaining fires, protecting the vulnerable, and ensuring communal survival. The return of light validated these efforts and reinforced social cohesion. Communal gatherings, storytelling, and ritual activities celebrated the sun's return, solidifying bonds, transmitting knowledge, and embedding cultural memory. Humans learned that survival was intertwined with social cooperation, and the solstice became a powerful teacher of interdependence, empathy, and the ethical dimensions of communal life. The interplay between environmental observation, emotional reinforcement, and social practice contributed to the development of social intelligence and a sophisticated understanding of collective responsibility. Cognitively, observing the sun's gradual return advanced the capacity for abstract reasoning and pattern recognition. Humans noted subtle changes in daylight, animal behavior, and plant life, linking these observations to practical strategies for survival and communal planning. The solstice provided a concrete example of cause and effect, teaching that careful attention to environmental patterns could yield predictable results. This process required memory, analytical thinking, and the integration of temporal sequences. Early humans were learning not only to react to immediate circumstances but to anticipate change, plan ahead, and understand relationships between action and consequence. The solstice functioned as a natural training ground for observation, reflection, and the development of predictive reasoning, forming the foundation for complex cognitive skills. Emotionally, the solstice also fostered the alignment of internal experience with external observation. The gradual lengthening of days mirrored shifts in perception and feeling, fear gave way to hope, uncertainty transformed into anticipation, and isolation evolved into social cohesion. This alignment of external cycles with internal states helped humans develop emotional regulation, resilience, and a nuanced understanding of temporal continuity. By internalizing these lessons, humans were able to navigate extreme conditions, anticipate positive change, and derive meaning from recurring patterns. The solstice thus served as a concentrated experience of psychological growth, linking perception, emotion, and cognition. Ritual and symbolic practice reinforced these lessons. Communities may have arranged fires in meaningful patterns, told stories reflecting the cycles of light and dark, or performed symbolic acts to honor the sun's return. These rituals codified knowledge of environmental patterns, survival strategies, and emotional insight, ensuring continuity across generations. By embedding practical and symbolic understanding into cultural practice, humans created a framework that linked observation, reflection, and communal action. The solstice became a shared touchstone, integrating survival, cognition, and symbolism into a coherent cultural and social experience. Memory and narrative were essential to preserving the lessons of the solstice. Humans needed to recall the extremes of the longest night, the incremental return of light, and the associated behaviors of plants and animals. Oral storytelling, ritual enactment, and communal observation ensured that these experiences were transmitted across generations. The solstice became a temporal reference point, anchoring understanding of seasonal cycles, guiding planning, and reinforcing social and cultural cohesion. Memory allowed humans to link past experiences with present action and future anticipation, creating a continuous framework for knowledge, survival, and symbolic thought. Philosophically, the solstice offered early humans insight into the nature of cycles, continuity, and transformation. Observing the transition from darkness to light illuminated patterns of adversity, endurance, and reward. Humans recognized that extremes are temporary, that perseverance has intrinsic value, and that life follows predictable rhythms. These insights fostered abstract thought, moral reasoning, and the emergence of symbolic frameworks that guided behavior, social norms, and cultural expression. The solstice provided a model for understanding the interplay between effort and outcome, struggle and renewal, fear and hope, laying the foundation for reflective consciousness and the human capacity to find meaning in the rhythms of existence. Ultimately, the period following the winter solstice represented an intricate convergence of survival, cognition, emotion, socialization, and symbolic reasoning. The incremental return of light validated endurance, strengthened communal bonds, and deepened understanding of natural cycles. Humans integrated observation with reflection, survival with symbolic interpretation, and action with narrative and ritual. The solstice became a concentrated lesson in the interconnectedness of life, a framework through which humans could navigate both the external world and internal experience. By witnessing and internalizing the gradual emergence of sunlight after the longest night, early humans discovered enduring truths about resilience, hope, and the cyclical nature of existence, forging cognitive, emotional, and cultural capacities that would shape the trajectory of humanity for generations. The slow emergence of light following the winter solstice marked a transformative period in the lives of early humans, a moment when the rhythms of the natural world intersected with the rhythms of the human mind. The longest night had tested endurance, patience, and vigilance, amplifying fear and uncertainty, while simultaneously fostering resilience, cooperation, and attentiveness. As the days began to lengthen, humans observed subtle changes in the environment, the pale glow of dawn stretching a little longer across the horizon, the faint warmth of the sun increasing day by day, and the shifting patterns of wildlife responding to the returning light. These changes were not simply noticed, they were internalized, forming a complex interplay between external phenomena and inner experience. Each incremental increase in daylight became a signal of continuity, an affirmation that darkness, no matter how oppressive, was temporary, and that life, through adaptation and cooperation, would endure. Practically, the increasing daylight expanded opportunities for survival-related activities. Extended hours allowed for more effective foraging, hunting, and preparation of resources that had been scarce during the longest nights. Communities could repair and strengthen shelters, craft tools, and organize collective efforts to manage the environment. The gradual return of light provided both a literal and figurative illumination, guiding humans to anticipate change, plan ahead, and align their behavior with natural cycles. The solstice functioned as a temporal marker that structured activity, reinforced attentiveness, and underscored the importance of preparation, observation, and adaptation. By recognizing the patterns inherent in the changing light, humans could synchronize their survival strategies with the rhythm of the world around them, learning that careful observation and coordinated effort produce tangible outcomes. Emotionally, the return of light carried profound relief and reassurance. The longest night had been a crucible of fear, uncertainty, and vulnerability, demanding the utmost endurance and social cohesion. The first signs of extended daylight offered validation, hope, and a sense of renewal. Humans could now witness the results of their vigilance and cooperation, linking effort with reward and perseverance with continuity. This emotional reinforcement strengthened resilience, optimism, and the capacity for reflective thought, demonstrating that the universe followed patterns that could be observed and relied upon. The solstice became a concentrated lesson in emotional regulation, patience, and the understanding that challenges, no matter how severe, were temporary and manageable through sustained effort and collective support. Symbolically, the solstice and the gradual increase in daylight became a canvas for meaning. Early humans likely projected qualities onto the sun, imagining it as a force engaged in struggle, endurance, and eventual triumph. The emerging light could be interpreted as a metaphor for hope, renewal, and the persistence of life over adversity. These symbolic associations were expressed and reinforced through ritual, storytelling, and communal celebration, transforming the solstice from a natural phenomenon into a profound cultural and philosophical event. Stories told around fires would recount the return of the sun, the endurance of life during darkness, and the eventual triumph of light, embedding lessons of resilience, observation, and symbolic reasoning into collective consciousness. The solstice thus became both an empirical and a metaphorical event, linking survival, observation, and narrative into a coherent system of understanding. The social implications of this period were equally significant. During the longest nights, humans had relied on cooperation for survival, sharing warmth, food, and protection. The return of light validated these collective efforts and reinforced the importance of social cohesion. Shared rituals, storytelling, and celebrations around the first extended sunlight strengthened bonds, transmitted cultural knowledge, and reinforced the interdependence of the group. The solstice became a focal point for communal experience, integrating environmental awareness with emotional reflection and social practice. Humans learned that survival was not only an individual endeavor but a collective one, and that empathy, cooperation, and mutual support were essential in navigating the extremes of existence. Observation of the environment during this period promoted cognitive sophistication. Humans noted the subtle progression of daylight, shifts in animal behavior, and changes in plant cycles, linking these observations to survival strategies and seasonal planning. The solstice illustrated cause and effect, teaching humans that careful attention to natural patterns could produce predictable outcomes. This engagement required memory, analytical thinking, and the integration of temporal sequences, fostering abstract reasoning and the ability to predict future events based on past experience. Through this process, humans developed cognitive frameworks for planning, problem-solving, and symbolic interpretation, transforming environmental observation into a foundation for complex thought. Emotionally, the solstice encouraged the integration of internal and external experience. The gradual lengthening of days mirrored changes in human perception and feeling. Fear gave way to hope, vulnerability to confidence, and isolation to communal engagement. This alignment between environmental cycles and psychological processes facilitated emotional regulation and resilience, allowing humans to navigate uncertainty, anticipate positive change, and find meaning in recurring patterns. By internalizing these lessons, humans could approach both survival and reflection with a deeper understanding of interdependence between inner and outer worlds. Ritual and symbolic practice reinforced these lessons. Fires might have been arranged in meaningful patterns, storytelling structured around the return of light, and symbolic acts performed to honor the sun's resurgence. These rituals codified practical knowledge, emotional insight, and symbolic meaning into repeatable communal activities. By participating in these practices, humans internalized lessons about cycles, endurance, and renewal, embedding them into collective memory and culture. The solstice thus served as both an environmental and cultural milestone, linking observation, reflection, and ritual into a coherent framework for understanding existence. Memory played a critical role in preserving and transmitting the lessons of the solstice. Humans needed to recall the duration and intensity of the longest night, the incremental return of light, and the behaviors of plants and animals that signaled seasonal change. Oral storytelling, ritual enactment, and communal observation ensured continuity of knowledge across generations. The solstice functioned as a temporal anchor, linking past experience with present awareness and future planning. Memory allowed humans to construct coherent frameworks for understanding cycles, cause and effect, and the interconnection between effort, reward, and survival. Philosophically, the solstice inspired reflection on cycles, continuity, and the nature of existence. By observing the transition from darkness to light, humans began to understand patterns of adversity, endurance, and renewal. They recognized that extremes are temporary, that effort and vigilance are meaningful, and that life follows predictable rhythms. These insights fostered abstract reasoning, moral reflection, and symbolic thought, laying the foundation for the development of cosmology, ritual, and narrative structures. The solstice became a model for interpreting the interplay between challenge and reward, fear and hope, despair and renewal, guiding both personal and collective understanding of the world. Ultimately, the period following the winter solstice represented a multidimensional convergence of survival, cognition, emotion, socialization, and symbolism. The incremental return of light validated endurance, strengthened communal bonds, and deepened understanding of environmental and temporal patterns. Humans integrated observation with reflection, survival with meaning, and action with ritual and narrative. The solstice became a concentrated lesson in resilience, continuity, and the interdependence of life, teaching humans to navigate both the external world and internal experience. By witnessing and internalizing the slow emergence of sunlight after the longest night, early humans developed enduring capacities for cognition, emotional intelligence, symbolic reasoning, and cultural continuity, shaping the trajectory of humanity for generations to come.